Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and today I am joined by two wonderful guests. The first of those is Dirk Stetille, who is an editor for INN and a diplomat for the Imperium. Say hello, Dirk.
Hi everyone.
And also January Valentine, who is a behind-the-scenes producer and researcher for Talking in Stations. Say hello, January.
How's this?
There we go. And the reason I've brought these two people along is because today we're going to be talking about what the big events really were of 2019, talking about why they're important, and kind of bringing you on a guided tour through the major political events and political narratives that have weaved their way through this year that you may or may not have been aware of as you were taking part in them, or how they've actually impacted you. And both of these people have a huge amount of experience going through the actual daily process of reporting on news, reporting on live events. I picked up my news, obviously, about halfway through the year, so I don't really get a huge amount of that until we get later on. But these two have been right on the front lines of bringing the very details of every individual fight, of every individual action to the public, and I think they're some of the best people that we can really get to discuss this topic. And we're going to be going through the year in chronological order. So let's start with the very, very first action of 2019, which is actually just following on from a war that we saw throughout 2018, which was the Perimeter War. And in January, we saw Legacy deploy to Oijanen, which is near Gemna, which was the base for Pandemic Horde at the time. And that was seen as quite a big movement, and a lot of people reported on it. But why was that such an important move? What helped trigger that, and what were the impacts of it, in your opinion?
So the kind of background here is that in kind of late 2018, Legacy and specifically Test Alliance dropped a keep star in the system of Perimeter right next to Jita. This keep star was designed to be a bit of a market hub for primarily things like Plex and skill injectors. And it was supposed to bring them in, a nice margin that could help fuel their nullsec conflicts. This was the first keep star, and to date, it's the only keep star that has ever been online in HiSec, to my knowledge. And it became pretty apparent very quickly that this would be a target of opportunity for, as you say, Pandemic Horde and the wider PanFam group. After a few months of back and forth with Pandemic Horde dropping competing structures in Perimeter and around the area, ProGod Legend decided that he was not particularly happy with this continuing on. This is when he announced that we would be that Pandemic Horde would be deploying to Oijanen and trying to take the fight to Pandemic Horde in Geminate as a way of tying Pandemic Horde up and kind of trying to prevent the amount of time they had to attack Perimeter in that kind of manner.
Yes, to follow up on that, they had staged. They had made quite a defensive stage in Oijanen to faction class Fortizars to regular Fortizars, and we know of one field structure there. They had brought daily harassment to Geminate. Pandemic Legion and Horde were staging nearby in BWF. Space Violence had a Fortizar in several structures in FDZA, and they had run basically daily harassment fleets out through that. Liberty Squad was up there prior. They were harassing their structures and renters in Kalevala Expanse. The actual turning point of the campaign came around January 16th, when ProGod failed to anchor a Fortizar in LX4. I believe what happened was Elo Knight alerted Northern Coalition and Pandemic Legion to a Sino Ares and it was a self-destruct Sino. So they had noticed a Rorqual coming in and logging off immediately, and they surmised that the Fortizar was in there. And so naturally, both sides hype ping it for 24 hours. They get ready for this Rorqual to log on, and when it does, they drop a super Northern Coalition and Pandemic Legion drop a super fleet. Pro God says fuck it, we're going to go all in. They have their dread bomb, and in the space of about 2 or 3 hours, Test loses approximately 633 billion. Snuff had come to help them as well, but unfortunately their Sino was in the wrong place. So they had Sinoed in, but they were so far out of range that the long range Titans from PL, or the Titans from PL, just picked them off quite easily. And so they basically said, we're going to go home because we obviously are not making any progress.
One of the really interesting aspects of this whole deployment, though, is kind of the way Test went about it. Test have, not only in this sort of mini campaign that they did to Oigenin, but in a lot of their campaigns over the last kind of 2 years or so, made significant use of the mechanic of jump cloning. So they won't deploy full time to this area and be constantly running combat ops. They will they'll run combat ops from there on a smaller scale all the time, but for major ops, they will jump clone their line members up to the particular deployment zone. They'll go out, they'll do the operation, and then they'll let their line members jump back home in order to, go ratting or mining or go about their daily business. And really with Oigenin, they kind of discovered the downside to that sort of mechanic, because they just couldn't keep the pressure up. And so Horde would be pressured a little bit by a few operations, and then they'd jump clone back home and spend a day or two, and Horde would kind of use that time to re-prepare, potentially re-hit their tests, structures, and high set, and then it would repeat itself. And it just wasn't going anywhere, which was really, as January pointed out, after that Fortizar loss, they just decided to call it there and return home without making any significant move forward on their objectives there.
Yes, they had a few things that were against them. One, that mechanic, it tires line members out. They have to have their attention split in 2 different regions. Second of all, when you bring an attacking force up, you're automatically going to be under the umbrella of the defending super coalition's super fleet, which is something I know Test did not want to deal with. The saving grace in that is they had snuffed out in the area that loved to drop on dreads and will take every opportunity to drop on a super carrier or Titan that is not quite being so intelligent and take kills that way. But it was very difficult to have meaningful fights under NC Dot and Pandemic Legion and Pandemic's Horde super fleet. So it was very grindy for sure.
Yeah. Am I right in understanding that in the aftermath of this, though, that we didn't see the actual aggression from Pandemic Horde against Tests, Citadels, and High Sec stop? Because I remember I did a podcast in April, and we were still kind of talking about this conflict as an ongoing thing.
Yeah, it kind of seemed to lessen off as other things were taking place. We'll discuss, a little bit later on, the issues that happened in Tenerife and Amencia, and Pandemic Horde kind of went that way a little bit. But yeah, the aggression definitely didn't slacken off for a few months yet. The perimeter trade hub was always under threat for the first probably 3 or 4 months of the year.
Right. What Pandemic Horde would do is they would spam these 0.1% ASBOs basically all over perimeter, and Legacy could not kill them fast enough.
We talked a little bit about why that was important earlier, but effectively what this was is it's kind of a passive income stream that Legacy was trying to monopolize, and through putting down those 0.1% Asbels, Pandemic Horde was able to basically disrupt that and take the margin for themselves, or at the very least deny some percentage of it to Legacy.
So the appeal for these kind of structures in perimeter is that you can't avoid all of the taxes that happen in an NPC station with a citadel, but you can avoid nearly half of them. So if you're selling a skill injector, or if you're selling Plex in a citadel, an upwell structure in perimeter, you can make more money for the same priced order in perimeter as you can in Jita. And so these 0.1% Asbels that January mentioned, the way they would work as a competing structure to the Tranquility Trading Tower Keepstar is that by putting them down, but having that tax level, you undercut the Tranquility Trading Keepstar. So people want to go to you rather than Tranquility Trading because they're paying less tax. And Pandemic Horde was still, by and large, making back enough money in the 3 or 4 days that those Asbels would be online to pay for the structure of it effectively. It was a self-propelling ability to spam these structures.
Right. So Test was basically fighting kind of a three-front war. One in Lowsec and in the surrounding Geminate Nullsec, in perimeter, and then finally back home in their space in the south.
That's not something we actually come to, but that is a great segue onto our next point, which is another large event that happened in January when the HRE, or the Holy Meteorite Coalition, as I believe it's labelled in your notes, January. For the sake of clarity, I'm going to be referring to it as the HRE, which stands for the Holy Renting Empire. And that is the coalition that took over the northeast from the DRF. So alliances like Skill Yourself, Volta,
Scourge.
H-Crab, Scourge, all those sorts of people. And they deployed down into 78 SS, which is in Torrid, right near the border with Tenerifis, and began to harass the legacy allies of FI.RE in the region.
Hold on.
Technically
Your
wasn't.
FRE hasn't come into being yet.
Are they still nominally a part of Legacy at this point?
Well, technically, yes. It's only Legion of X-Death right now. They were given some space following their eviction by HRE, but Red Alliance is still in period basis at the.
We still have people like Razor Alliance, though, and a couple of other smaller Russian alliances and Russian-aligned alliances working with Legion of X-Death here, though.
Yeah, this is definitely still
back in 2018. It's the core alliances, yeah.
It's the core alliances of what we previously knew as the Drone Regions Federations.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to put it. The kind of the limping remnants.
Yeah, the animated corpse almost at this point, but
well, they'd have quite the resurgence throughout the year.
Yeah, they do go on to do quite well. But yes, as you pointed out, they deployed south 77 S8. They're hitting Legion of X-Death, Brave Newbies, Test Alliance, and other alliances in Legacy are going across in Nullsec in the south to kind of support Legion of X-Death and the DRF in their defense against this, which was effectively a slow retreat. I don't think anybody will argue that the DRF was just slowly ceding space.
In my notes, their favorite places, I believe, to have conflict was 46 DP in Tenerifis and YTAC FZ 5N in Imensia. The latter region provided great range. Those guys seem to have just really just come in and jump bridges were the favorite thing to reinforce. I think between Razor and Legion of Exdeath, they lost 6 in January alone. So coming in there, shutting down their navigational network and placing Rotarus and Astra houses as these mobile safe spots throughout the region really was not really welcomed by XIX at all. And so when Test came back down after their campaign, they were concentrated on fighting these guys.
It's probably worth noting that there was an NIP between Legacy and Winter Coalition at this point, which are the two people that are sitting on either side of this kind of geographic divide, technically. They both agreed, not to deploy structures against one another and a couple of things like that. And this starts to really put a lot of pressure on that NIP because it's going to expire sometime in February. And already now, with the last month of the treaty, which came into effect about 6 months, it was a 6-month long treaty, if I remember correctly, after UALX. So it was going to come up very, very soon in the year, and we already started to see deployments of entities that are hostile to Legacy in winter space starting to attack Legacy, and that's obviously something that put Legacy on this huge edge. It's probably what caused them to, I think to some degree, want to give up that deployment in the northeast as quickly as they did, because of the threat that potentially put them under. Whilst, obviously Legion of XX Death were not... I don't think it was going to be an existential problem if Tenerifis collapsed under just the attack from Skill U for them, but it would also not be in their best interest for that to happen at the end of the day.
Yeah,
right.
For sure. Go ahead.
Vili made mention on Reddit that East Tenerifis was not covered under the NIP, which I believe where these attacks were concentrated on. So they were mobilizing. They were definitely preparing. The NIP actually would expire in March 22nd, but be canceled a week earlier than that, just because of these aggressive postures taken by Fraternity. Allowing structures to be anchored in spaces that they said they wouldn't. In this day that structures can be instantly transferred, it is so easy to have a neutral entity anchor a Fortizar and then transfer it right over to someone like Skill yourself or any other very hostile, aggressive entity that is right on your border. So I definitely believe that they saw that as a threat.
Yeah, and it would be silly not to. As you noted that kind of line of the NIP kind of went straight between Detorid and Dementia, and also midway through Tenerifis, effectively. And yeah, the Fortizar that went down, the couple of Fortizars that went down pretty much right on the border of the NIP were fairly obvious staging structures, but at the same time, is it a staging Fortizar, or is it just a structure that you're putting down? They were perfectly well within their rights to put down structures on their side of the border. So it's one of those things where Test was aware at the same time as these bits and pieces that were going on in HiSec, in the Forge, in Oigenen, in Geminant were happening. The deployment of forces in the south had to have had Test, Pro-God Legend, and Vili, especially Test's military directors, really wondering where they wanted to put their focus and whether or not they would need to withdraw a little bit from the north to focus on their home space.
Right. I believe following the northern campaign, given that tests lost approximately 1.1 to 1.2 trillion, they were kind of tired. They wanted to take a step back and figure out exactly how they were going to approach this. At the end of January, they will lose a Nyx and a Titan, moving back down through Snuff by Snuffed Out. We all kind of know of the Reddit, like Billy going on Reddit and being like, what happened, dude? We were working together for years and years, and Snuffed goes, well, we aren't exactly blue, so what did you expect? So it was kind of a bad week for Test. They had just retreated from the north. They anchored their Keepstar, but they had lost all of their structures in Origin, and so they were like, okay, how can we go about this, because this is coming, everyone's tired, we need to make some money, how are we going to focus on that? So that's why I think it's mostly quiet between January, February, and only getting into March do they decide to bring the hammer back down again.
Yeah, and whilst all this is going on, we do have a couple of other little conflicts that I'd like to mention. I don't think they're hugely important, because they're something that ends up happening kind of parallel to a lot of these conflicts. It's not really written into it until we get very much near the end of the year. But there was obviously a war in Pureblind between the Beyond Syndicate coalition, at least that's what it was called at the time, and some Imperium-ish aligned forces like FXR, Bandalogs, intergalactic space hobos, all those kind of people, and they were kind of wrestling with, as I said, the Beyond Syndicate coalition, which was like UFC. I don't think Triumvirate. I think Triumvirate was part of it during the very early half of the year, but they eventually left to just like UFC and Reverberation Project and a couple other people, something like that. I don't know the exact coalition that ended up forming there, but effectively you had this kind of small war going on, and that was kind of cool. And it's always important to mention those sorts of things. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Well, Snuff definitely did not like Triumvirate. I believe anytime Triumvirate tried something, Snuff would just drop dreads on it. It was Triumvirate trying to carve out a space in Pureblind after their eviction from the south. They are going to fight extensively with Bandalogs and intergalactic space hobos around the Pureblind area, predominantly like ROIR, Ewok, and up into that region or those constellations. But it's mostly a small back and forth. They aren't really going to have a huge influence either way, but they do bat phone, like Ranger Regiment, Snuffed Out will come to the, in the other side, that kind of thing. It's just kind of like a back and forth grind.
Yeah, Pureblind in the early parts of this year were quite interesting. What was quite interesting, sorry, as a region that was very much its own microcosm, almost. There were a lot of smaller groups fighting backwards and forwards. I know at some point this year, Snuffed Out held a constellation in there. Bandalogs was mentioned already. There were a lot of different groups, kind of very small groups on the nullsec scale, but also very PvP focused groups. And these are people who don't want to overextend themselves, so they'll only take a constellation or two, but they'll definitely be constantly kind of trying to fight with one another about different things. So structures, could be moon mining, could be solve, just because they want to, I don't know, experience some fun and engaging gameplay. And it definitely is a really interesting region, not on the large scale or as one of the major things that happened, but just as an area that has a lot of fighting comparative to the amount of people that are in it.
Yeah. The one thing that I will mention that becomes a little important later on is the fact that a lot of these local groups, and especially the groups that were anti-Triumvirate and working with Snuffed Out, were also very anti-GOTG/Dead Coalition. because obviously Pureblind is in jump range of a lot of of Deadco renters. So groups like Dracaris at the time, that will just rat in capitals, and their raison d'etre is to go out there and try to hunt those things and kill them. So you end up with Snuffed Out getting involved in a little bit of anti-Deadco action even as early as January, and that's something that ends up being important later on in the year because it starts a war in Fate. But that's, again, the problem is, this is kind of one of the problems of charting any sort of EVE Online chronology, is that all of these little events trickle into one another, because it's all about the connections between other people and other organizations and how those get made and how those then get utilized in the future. I don't know if you guys feel the same way about that.
Oh, for sure. One of the greatest, I would say, joys putting together something like this is you get to watch all these little events. The meta in EVE is very real, and we, step by bloody step, walk towards it every single day. Nothing exists in a vacuum in EVE. Time is truly a circle here, and you see groups rise and then fall, and then they'll go somewhere else and rise again, and someone else will knock them down. So it's incredibly interesting. What I really particularly enjoy is between the shadow of coalitions and super coalitions are little semi-independent groups that live and kind of die in the shadows of these guys. And so watching their struggles unfold month by month, or even week by week sometimes, is really interesting. You get a little zoom in on these guys that, most of the time, no one really knows that they exist unless you live like right in the neighborhood. So being able to kind of bring a spotlight to these guys and their struggles is really interesting, and it's very fun.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting to look back at these kind of things. You introduced us both, Jin'taan, as members of the EVE media, people who focus on things that happen on a day-to-day basis. I have conversations with people, again, practically every day on Discord, talking about this thing that's happened or that thing that's happened, and is this breaking news? Is that breaking news? Is this something that we want to focus a little bit more on over a period of a few days? And so, in that sense, I'm constantly moving from one event to the next event to the next event. But just every couple of months or so to take a step back and take some stock and really look at how one thing has flowed into another. Relationships are always evolving in EVE. There are a lot of things that I could probably bring up as an example of that, but Snuffed Out is somebody that we've touched on already. They were the big low-sec boogeyman for a while. We developed relationships with them through the Space Violence SIG and their kind of SIG-focused deployments. They then became a member of the Imperium. After a while, they transitioned back out of the Imperium, went back to low-sec, then they were in Pureblind. And so these groups are constantly interacting and then kind of moving away from each other and then moving back. And it's really interesting, as I say, just to take that step back and realize this is where this all came from. And from there, see if you can predict a little bit of where it's going to move forward to as well.
To understand the future, you must first understand the past.
I don't know of any scenario that is more true than EVE, for sure. It's very tempting to look back into 2018 to see how things that we are covering in January and February and March were set up, in 2018. But when you get to 2018, you want to go back to 2017 and see how those things were set up, and you just kind of have to put blinders on yourself and just be like, no, I'm going to just focus on 2019. But it is incredible watching a narrative flow through the years to come to some conclusion. It's truly impressive.
Yeah. Now, we do have one final other thing that we wanted to mention in January, and that's a Revenant dying down in Providence, and a Waffles Revenant of that. And to kind of give you an idea of just how busy years in EVE Online are nowadays, 6 Revenants died over the course of 2019. And I remember a time when no Revenants had died, and it was the first one to ever die, and that was huge news. People were talking about it for weeks. But we live in a bit of a different game now, where I think it is more storyline driven than ever before, because there are so many relatively few assets that are the sole result of a lot of people working together to bring them into existence. It feels like assets now are more personalized. People can see themselves owning a Revenant. People can see themselves owning a Titan, and that doesn't feel like a huge aspirational multi-year goal. It feels like something they can do in 6 months if they really try. I think that's just the nature of the slow creep of power in EVE Online, unfortunately.
Well, it's part of the nature of the slow creep, but it's also an aspect of the game mechanics. Rock walls were changed back in 2016, I want to say, late 2016.
Yeah, that'd be correct.
And the immediate impact of the rock wall changes and the introduction of upwell mining structures for moons was no, that wasn't mining structures, that was industry structures, Stettilles and such, was one, that people suddenly had the ability to mine a whole lot more ore than they had before, and 2, that they could build more super capitals at once than they had been able to before as well, because a single Stetille can support as many jobs as you have characters with the skills. Whereas before, a single POS anchored on a moon could only support one super capital construction build. So the mechanic shift way back when has kind of made it so that these ships, these Revenants and Titans, even just standard Titans, avatars and Erebuses and what have you, they're so much more accessible. They are so much cheaper than they were 5 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. And so, yeah, they are a lot more accessible. But it's interesting, especially with the Revenant. It's such a rare ship in terms of how many die, as you mentioned. There were 6 in 2019. There were only 2 in 2018 and 4 in 2017. It kind of seems to go in waves with the Revenant a little bit in how many die. But yeah, it was the really interesting thing here is not to go back into the history of it. And I know we've just done a section on history and how you say one thing and you want to immediately go back, and then I fell into the trap. But yeah, the really interesting thing about this Revenant that died in Providence, the Waffles Revenant, is that it died in Providence. I know you as an ex-Providence FC probably were cheering this kill, but it really was kind of a turning point, I think, for Providence after a while of being beaten on and beating on to turn around and be able to kill one of the most difficult super capitals in the game to trap and kill.
It's not actually the first time Providence has done that. I remember that Alistair Sharp managed to notch one of those up on his belt before he left in 2018. But yeah, this one was set up by Lord Mop, or Lord Mop 1, who is a very old friend of mine. Was my Capital FC for a long time when I was in Provi. He was there before me, and as you can probably tell, he was there after me. And yeah, they were able to just set up a pretty nice trap and frag it out. There's not much more you can say than that. But you got to hand it to them for occasionally getting a win. And as you say, it does seem like that carried them through the first half of the year. And we'll be talking about exactly what wars were going down for Providence as we get into the next couple of months.
One thing I will say before we transition into February is there was one small piece of news that I don't think got really reported. was that in period basis, Red Alliance and Midas 22 had to give up their space to Goonswarm Federation, as it had plans to turn that region into their own rental group, offering it as a safer alternative for kind of the tumultuous systems owned by PanFam to the in the Northeast. So those two entities will come into the light mid-February, but I just want to set that up.
There's a certain amount that I can and can't say about that. I will say that, you know, it was never a forced transition. And we'll talk about that as we get into towards final reunion and the Fire Coalition in a little minute.
Oh my gosh, you're going to spoil it.
The problem with a timeline where we all know what's going to happen. But yeah, so as we get into February, the first topic is one that's near and dear to my heart, and this was the unfortunate announcement that the Alliance tournament would not be taking place in 2019. And for those who don't know, the Alliance tournament is a yearly tournament where, as the name implies, alliances get to send a representing team and fight it out for the glory of the tournament and hundreds of billions of ISK in prizes. And there had been a lot of controversy over it in 2018. Prize ships hadn't been announced until very, very late in the whole process. Teams hadn't applied for it in the same numbers that they had the year before. I personally thought that the rule set in 2018 was pretty cool, but I know some people also had issues with it. And it was also done entirely by Event-T, which is the first time that that's ever happened. So the whole of the production was actually done out of house from CCP, which is a very unusual step for them to take.
That just to clarify that's specifically the streaming production and the general management. Anything that involved GM teleporting and stuff on Tranquility was still done by CCP devs.
Yep, sorry, that is very important to note. And refereeing was done by CCP.
Yes, CCP still maintained the integrity of GM tools on Tranquility, but everything else was done by Event-T and the plus 10 guys. And can I just say, before we delve into the AT stuff, they did a fantastic job with their production quality.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like Bay and Nash and EQ11 and Biohazard and just everyone involved in that. Like, there's so many people I want to thank. God, I can't even remember his name, but there's a guy who just, all he does for the entire tournament is just sit there and update the ticker all day, and he does it so well. I feel bad that I can't mention it. There's people like that you don't see. Oh, and Alexi and his significant other, whose name I forget, and she's going to slap me now, who do all the stats taking, and you have people, all the hosts. Oh my god, it is so much work. Like, people who've never been on a broadcast do not understand how tiring it is to have to sit there and talk for 8 hours a day and try and look like you know what you're doing for 4 hours of that.
Well, we know that looking like you know what you're doing is very difficult for you, Jin'taan, but we'll forgive you.
At least we got to do some pretty cool skits that we wouldn't have been able to do on CCP's stream, I will say that.
Yeah, so kind of coming back to this whole Alliance tournament announcement, the first little bit of controversy that kind of kicked off about the Alliance Tournament 17 that was kind of minor in the grand scheme, but was that the actual dev blog was posted as an update on Alliance Tournament 17. So, you know, a lot of players, a lot of teams, well-known teams, were already starting to do practices internally. They were trying to, you know, get themselves back to their bleeding edge so that they could really compete for those top podium positions. And so CCP kind of posted this, and everyone who was already really hyped about it immediately went, oh my god, yes, we're getting the dates, it's time to put ourselves into overdrive, guys. And even a lot of the smaller teams were seeing that and going, okay, we need to start thinking about the Alliance tournament now. And of course, the rug was pulled out rather swiftly. It was announced by CCP Falcon that this would be a hiatus. So not cancelled, not, it's never coming back, but it will be a hiatus. And, well, that took the wind out of a lot of people's sails. Obviously, CCP have been working on other things. The Invasion World Tour, for example, was a huge amount of work for them. But this was something that was near and dear to a lot of people because they could do it on the live server and interact with a bunch of people from around the world and just kind of show themselves off a bit.
Yeah, I know a lot of... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, for me personally, I know it was a lot of work. It was literally 20 hours a week. We would have matches all day, Saturday and Sunday practicing. And the fact that I get to wear my AT medal or my 2 AT medals is somewhat of a kind of a bit of a proud spot for me. It's not many people get to do that. And so to be able to say I was there, I was in the ring, it was the most intense PvP fight I've ever been in. So yeah, I could see why a lot of people were upset.
All right. Well, so as you mentioned there, Dirk, it was officially announced as a hiatus. But I want to point out that it is December the 21st as of recording, and we have not had anything confirmed about the Alliance tournament next year.
I mean, not to spoil your timeline here a bit, but I wasn't... The real issue about the whole AT question and whether it's going to come back is that CCP Falcon said in his dev blog that the Alliance tournament will return. But a lot of what we've been talking about collectively over the year, over the last 18 months almost, as players, is the question of, are we listening to what CCP are saying, or are we focusing on what they're doing? And given the way other tournaments have turned out this year, obviously the Anger Games was looking to come back when CCP announced that there would be support for fresh tournaments. And that fell through on the basis of various CCP restrictions. Suetonia was looking at doing a tournament. That fell through. The Streamfleet Invitational, which you ran, Jin'taan, and I was very happy to be a player in and a part of, had some significant issues. I'm not sure that we can really expect anything in terms of the Alliance tournament returning for probably at least the next 9 months, if it ever does come back. And I hope it does. If it comes back, I will be right there ready to get back in the ring. But we'll see. We can only wait and see at this point.
Yeah. I could be very mad about this, but I just want to say to people, if this is the kind of thing that upsets you, if you're the kind of person who wants to see the Alliance tournament come back, do not take out your anger at people like CCP Fozzy or CCP Dopamine, who are like kind of the CCP, the public-facing side of the Alliance tournament, the people you would associate with the Alliance tournament. Let me tell you, they are not the problem. They would love to have the time to actually work on this, and the resources to get it done, and the resources to revamp the tournament tool and everything like that. They are not the problem. The problem is the upper management of CCP, who does not put any value into competitive play for EVE Online. So if you want to change that attitude, you need to make it very clear to CCP that that is something you hold in high regard, and that CCP should hold in high regard. There you go. That's my call to action on that. We can go on now.
Yeah, we've had our soapbox for a minute. Let's
keep moving. It's probably important to mention, by the way, that if you haven't realised, we are going to talk about big events that CCP took part in this year, not just big events that the players created. but speaking of creating things, the next big event in February was the creation of fi.re, and we had a little struggle with naming them earlier, but these are the kind of ex-DRF remnants, but merged with the Red Alliance and Midas 22, so the kind of Imperium Russians.
The Red Menace Coalition is what they were called when they were in period basis. For a little bit more history, roughly, very rough history, there was a Red Alliance way back when. I don't have the dates to hand. My memory is not that good. But there was a Red Alliance. Then there was a schism. That schism formed the Red Menace Coalition and the Drone Regions Federation. And then sort of these two different Russian blocks had different areas of space. So the Red Menace Coalition obviously has been in period basis, or was in period basis, for basically forever. Equally with the Drone Region Federation, they had a lot of the drone regions at various points and less of the drone regions at other points. But they were generally considered to be an immovable object in that region of space. We talked about the attack by HRE on the DRF earlier on. That caused the DRF to move towards the Legacy into Tenerifis. And yeah, as you mentioned, this fi.re, or Final Reunion, as they call themselves as a coalition name, this was kind of the coming together of two previously opposed groups. This was them realizing that as a Russian bloc, they are probably stronger together. Now, January tried to suggest that, the Red Menace were forced out of period basis a little while ago. That wasn't quite the case. I will say that the space period basis was purchased from Red Menace Coalition as they wanted to move on, and we've remained friendly with the guys over there. They're doing fairly well as a coalition and are kind of more siding with Legacy at the moment than anything else. But honestly, given Legacy's situation at the moment, that's really not a bad move.
I apologize if I said forced. It's kind of hard as a neutral person trying to comb through like an INN report or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wasn't saying that to be disparaging at all. That was just
It's very helpful to have someone who is actually probably in those discussions. But forced. They weren't forced. I did not realize that there was ISKs transferred, but I just know that between the last week, all of their stuff suddenly dropped, and it was because of that rental program that I believe Aerith talked about on the Meta Show. But anyways, moving a bit forward or back, I distinctly remember one of your videos, Jin'taan, about Stainwagon and Stainfragon, that period of time. What was it, 2016, 2017 maybe?
Yeah, the Winter War in 2016 to 2017.
Right. So we're seeing a continuation of that because Midas 22 and Red Alliance end up moving to period basis, but they will come together, old foes in this Final Reunion coalition to fight off Skill Yourself that has been being such a pain this month, killing Ansiblex's Fortizars. Well, they had tried to make a play for a few Fortizars, and even when the structures were saved, they still won the ISK war. So I think one of the best fights that I had saw from them is they had managed to kill 10 billion worth of stuff and only lose under a billion. So these guys definitely picked their fights carefully, and they had a favorite. They used Loki's, Nightmares, and Macarials very skillfully, and definitely ran circles around some of these Legion of X death guys.
Yeah, but this does lead to the bolstering of the bolstering of that kind of ex-DRF remnant force, and I think it might be fair to say as well that the Red Menace Coalition was definitely not at the strongest it's ever been. We are far from the time in 2003 when them and Goons combined were basically the equivalent of the whole game.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair.
Yeah. They were both very much at the zenith of their power, so it makes sense that when they both see that, they both come together under the banner of, hey, we're all Russians, let's go do Russian things. And they band together, they go out east, they hit Tenerifis, and they're going to try and hold off against the HRE. And however, that's when we get the next act in this. Seeing this stronger force, HRE and Winter start to work together a lot more, and we see even heavier fighting in the region of Tenerifis, with both of them just clashing time and time again over, as you said, jump gates, fortizars, things like that. And the fighting really starts to intensify. Is this the point at which Legacy starts to also come over and really pitch in as well? I know they've been helping out before because XIX was a part of Legacy, but they were to an extent leaving them on their own for the day-to-day. Do we start to see Legacy reinforce them in February, or was that later on?
The kind of way that went was that the DRF, when they moved away from the HRE invasion kind of late last year, they went to catch mostly, crashed on Legacy's couch a bit. Going into this year, the final reunion formation stuff, that was what led the Russians to kind of move into their own space in Tenerifis. Obviously, Tenerifis is kind of in Legacy's area of influence, but it was also kind of their own space. It was space for them to grow into. And so, yeah, Legacy are definitely kind of a background player at the time. They're definitely tracking what's going on, but as we mentioned, kind of towards the end of January, Legacy are still trying to figure out what's going on that eastern border. They're trying to figure out how they're dealing with the Tranquility Trading Tower and HiSec, and so they're very much still a background player at that point.
Right. And when you say Legacy, you mean mostly Test.
Mostly Test, but I am always loath to discount Brave Coalition and Brave Federation, sorry, and the various other groups in there. Federation Uprising are a group that I've worked with in the past, and I know that they're a great bunch of guys who are always spoiling for a fight. So, Legacy still has the smaller groups are still very much interested in PvPing, and so I would always hesitate to discount them as a collective.
Right, that's true. Right, Federation Uprising actually left at the end of January. It was believed that they could not contest snuffed out anymore in their regions of Blackrise and Placid. So one of the largest Galmil alliances, or Galente militia alliances, decided to head to Legacy and find some content there.
Yeah, the decline of Galmilistan. Galmilistan obviously being Cloud Ring, where a number of Galente militia alliances had taken nullsec sovereignty in the latter months of 2018.
Yeah, and that's actually an alliance that will come in to play a lot of kind of interesting roles. They're one of the alliances that tends to be involved everywhere, even if they don't have a huge impact.
Yeah,
they seem like very active. Anyway, the final event of the month that we have noted down to talk about here was Burn Jitter. So that wasn't something I tracked too closely. It just feels like an annual, well, I'm not going to do any trading this week, kind of feeling to me. So do you guys have any more experiences with that in particular this year?
January, do you want to jump in before I talk a bit?
I actually don't really have anything to do with Burn Jita besides report on it.
Fair enough. So, Burn Jita, for anybody listening to this who doesn't know, and if you don't, I feel sorry for you, is or has been generally a roughly annual event in which the vast majority of the Imperium deploys to Jita for a weekend of murder and mayhem. Largely, this is focused on freighters. Freighters moving in and out of the primary trade hub in Jita, but also it has often been very high value mission running ships or an orca or something that we know that we can kill with 250 baying goons. The reason that this is noteworthy, particularly this year, is because potentially it is the last Burn Jita to happen, at least in the next few years. Later on in the year, CCP would deploy a patch that allows ships to warp within 3 minutes of being bumped. And for anyone who doesn't know, freighter bumping is a significant part of how Burn Jita's pace was maintained. You know, freighters would be bumped for 20 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes maybe, while fleets were killing other targets, and then we would just cycle through. And so this warp change really does kind of lessen the ability of the support crew for Burn Jita, who do absolutely fantastic work. You know, you're talking about a 96-hour period in which there's probably a group of 20 or 25 people getting about 4 hours of sleep a night, just making sure that this entire thing is rolling smoothly. And it really does, that CCP patch really has kind of inhibited the ability to make sure that there are always targets available. So yeah, this was noteworthy for this recap simply because it is potentially the last Burn Jita of the year, of EVE's history, almost.
Well, I think they would still do it, but perhaps not on the gigantic scale that they did in the years prior. In my opinion, that kind of makes sense. You know, it's not really fun being bumped for 45 minutes, knowing that your entire freighter that's completely defenseless can't do anything. You know, so I'm not opposed to. I'm opposed to like taking it out completely because, you know, stupidity should always be punished, in my opinion. But you know, perhaps the rate at which it happened was perhaps excessive.
All right, well, let's move on to March then. And the first thing I really want to highlight there is the battle between... a specific battle going on that went on there. I'm just seeing if I can find the notes.
Well, the first Komodo died in March, didn't it?
Oh, did it?
Yes. It was kind of an interesting story. Norris came on to Talking Stations and talked about it, and he had spent the good part of the day getting the run around from Test. They had tackled some of his oracles, and he was trying to bridge fleets around, and he had mispositioned 2 of his Titans, an Erebus and a Ragnarok, and Test had chewed through those pretty quickly. But as the super fleet was leaving, Komodo got bumped off the regional gate back into their territory, a Komodo belonging to Test that it was, and he was stranded 45 kilometers away. And I know that does not seem like a long stretch of distance, but to a Komodo that had just finished kicking the hornet's nest, it was, you know, a light year in distance.
Specifically a Komodo that doesn't have a propulsion module.
Exactly. So you're stuck there. Fraternity quickly regrouped and tackled and killed the Dread. Fraternity took a beating that day. I believe they lost 265 billion, but Test definitely took that trophy with almost 400 billion lost. and the first, I believe it was the first Komodo ever made as well.
Yeah, I think you're actually right on that. It is to date the only Komodo ever to have been lost as well. I think people saw this and potentially got a little bit more careful with their use of their faction titans for a while.
Well, it's one of the reasons why Snuffed Out was so good at what they did, is they just watched people with supers and titans be kind of dumb with them, and not necessarily this guy was being dumb, but they had a kill and they were very excited. You know, it was a chance to kind of flex their super fleet back home from the north, and so killing, you know, the Alliance Exos 2 titans, you know, just got everyone kind of pumped up, and all it took was one misplaced bump, and this guy lost the crown jewel of their super fleet.
Yeah, 240 billion Z-kill value. That's, you know, more than half of what Test lost that day. It's a huge amount.
That week was so crazy too. The day before in the north, Siberian squads had attempted to bait out Triumvirate, and they sent 2 super carriers and I believe a couple of faxes, and it ended up with such a brawl that they lost 8 of them when Snuffed Out saw the fight and dropped dreads. Triumvirate had escalated to dreads as well. Northern Coalition would end up coming up in Feroxes to kill off the Snuffed Out dreads. They called for help. Initiative came in like a fleet of Tengus, I believe, and that gave them enough breathing room to get the dreads out. But it went completely sideways for Siberian squads. They lost 8 out of the 25 that they dropped, and it was a very bad day for them. So yeah, it was just a crazy week. I believe I calculated almost $1 trillion worth of VISC had lost between like the 2nd and the 5th of March. That could possibly be a record. I'm not sure.
That is a lot of ISK. It's probably not a record for the year though, given the largest fight in the year was over $1 trillion ISK.
That's true.
You know, the fight that I was trying to talk about earlier before we got onto this, though, was the fight in H6 TAC down in Providence. And
you and your Providence.
I like Providence, and the reason I wanted to cover this is because this is actually a war that we talked earlier on about how, you know, the history of things and how things stretch on for time and time and time. What we're going to be talking about here is a war that effectively started in 2017. This is the last continuation of the anime war, basically, because Wrecking Crew and that kind of low-sec group has always been there, and they've always kind of nudged around at Northern Providence and tried to take some of the space near Assar, or at the very least, you know, throw down some structures and force some fights over it. But the size disparity between Providence and that coalition had always been so great that it was never a realistic threat. However, in the wake of the Anime War and the Reconquista, a lot of alliances, a lot of the larger like holder alliances went over to Legacy. So groups like Invictus, groups like Coalition Hispania, so even Uli Federation went over to that side of the woods. So Probby Block lost a lot of members, and because of that, it was pretty easy for them to get that initial foothold during the war, during and after the war, and just kind of hold it even through the Reconquista. I believe they were actually able to hold onto their station even because Legacy was so busy fighting PL and NC Dot in the region that it just seemed pointless to go and hassle with that one. But
right, I believed Tactical Supremacy ended up leaving as well.
Yes, Tactical Supremacy were never a part of Providence. You
okay.
Probably, I don't know who you're thinking of there.
Well, I know that they ended up going back later this year. Right, so maybe they weren't with Probby Block, but perhaps they kind of shared Providence and kind of
Back when I was in Providence, we always had a very hostile relationship with Tickle and the other part of that coalition, because of some long-standing hostility between them and the leaders of Apocalypse Now. But because they used to all be together in the AU time zone of Providence, but they fell out, which led to them going to Legacy in the first place. And ever since then, they've kind of had a little bit of grudge between one another, because people work like that, I guess.
Right.
But anyway,
man, the history slide. You're gonna have to like put in a PSA at the start of this podcast, basically going, there will be a lot of random mentions of things that happened in history.
deep Providence lore.
Yeah.
I feel like the saying, if you want to make an apple pie, first you must recreate the universe, is very applicable right now, because in order to understand, like, yeah, just simply Tickle moving out and then coming back in, you have to understand the Pravi conflicts, which I'm sure Jin'taan has covered in so much depth. But yeah, and then of course we're going back in time again, but
Basically, Providence hasn't seen peace during this whole time. Someone's always been invading them. And now it's just down to Wrecking Crew.
Has anyone ever not been invading Providence? It kind of feels like Providence is just the kind of punching bag of the galaxy. You know,
Actually,
whenever you can't like stage a real war, you know what? We'll go to Providence and we'll have some fun.
Yeah, well, during the entirety of 2016, no one fought us, basically. We had like one deployment from Triumvirate and one deployment from Init for the whole year. And those lasted like a month each. It was really boring.
Speaking of initiative, they would have they would announce a campaign to Hakoden in February, but it was not long lasting at all. I think within like the first, by the second week of March, so roughly 3 weeks, they decided to leave. But I remember Sister Bliss herfing it up about it, and it ended up not going anywhere.
Rip. Anyway, just to wrap this up, effectively what happened was there was a big fight here over an Astra House, and this was another fight along with, we saw earlier them killing a Waffles, and Waffles were part of Wrecking Crew during this point, as well as being aligned to Pan Fam. You had them kill that, and then they won this fight. And although Wrecking Crew were able to secure the strategic objective and kill an Astra House, they lost 70 billion ISK for the privilege and only killed about 20 billion ISK. And this is something we see a fair bit during like the first half of the year, is Providence actually doing fairly well and managing to win a few capital fights. Because most of their capital FCs are active. You still have people like Vishnogradsky and Lord Mop being really active and carrying a lot of weight for the coalition.
Yeah, they will carry this with so far throughout the year. They'll have this really good back and forth with Wrecking Crew, which I think they're pretty happy about, judging by, we had some of the guests on, I believe, in one of our summer midweek shows, but yeah, they seem to both be enjoying themselves.
Yeah, and obviously Wrecking Crew is enjoying it because, their raison d'etre is just to get content. They've never hugely cared about owning space. Although some of the subsidiary members, so the people who aren't like Few/Waffles, people like the Rogue Consortium, Templars Calcif, do care a little bit more about that because they gain stuff from it as their organizations.
Right. So another really interesting thing that happened in March is Elo Knights Corp Origin leaves Black Legion ... I apologize if I forget a dot. They are helping Fraternity in the Southern War against Legacy Coalition. That's going to be intensely helpful for Fraternity, as they are mostly Chinese time zone alliance, and so having those US and slight EU numbers will be very helpful against a predominantly EU heavy coalition such as Legacy.
It's also really important not to underestimate just how much impact having someone like Elo Knight can bring when they're being really active. Like having an FC of a high caliber who will literally sit down and run a fleet every day, or 2 to 3 fleets a day, is unbelievable. It changes what you can do as a strategic commander.
I think,
definitely.
Like, in the first week, he drops 3 Titans. I know one of which was his own. He ended up killing 2 Legion of X-Death Titans, and then 6 Force Auxiliaries that die to save them. So yeah, it really kind of changed the fraternity's weight they were able to punch above.
Yeah, the renowned Munin FC Elo Knight is memes aside, generally has been somebody who can turn the tide of a conflict if he's there at the right moments and can make the right calls without having his hands tied by other strategic commanders. He's definitely one of the FC ilk that has to be free. He will work within a campaign, but he has to be free to make his own decisions and be creative about that, because that's how the results come around.
I hate to be the kind of person who's going to make comparisons to people who play EVE Online to people who play other video games, but I would actually kind of compare him to Simple from CS:GO.
I don't know what that reference means, so you're going to have to.
I will explain it. I'll explain it. It's fine. So Simple is someone who is like a star system in the Russian team, Na'vi. And historically, he's had a lot of issues in team play because it's probably going to be better to call him like someone like a Nico. Nico probably better, who is the star player of FaZe, which is a multinational team basically of all star players. So imagine like you had a football team where you had like Ronaldo, I don't know, Beckham, and like all of those players. Even though some of them aren't very good anymore, you look at it on paper and you're like, how could this team possibly lose? But the main star of their team is very, very resource hungry and very, very demanding as a personality in how they want to win. And Elo Knight is someone who kind of acts in that way to a degree. They're someone who can absolutely win you a game, win you a war, but equally Elo Knight can lose you a war because if you build your strategy around him and he just doesn't turn up, everything goes to shit because there's no one else who can do what he does.
Okay, that was a very belabored comparison, but I definitely see the point.
Like, the thing is, he has to have such a specific structure around him that you can't plug and play anyone else into it.
Yeah, definitely. If he oversleeps on a timer where he was going to be running the thing, there is nobody else.
I've ever heard of an instance where Elo Knight slept when he was supposed to be out on a timer. Like, that's
totally true.
From all of my chats throughout the year with him, it's just like he was like running on like 5 or 6 hours of sleep on top of work. And
I will say nothing about the use of stimulants.
Yeah, but no, he is.
I don't think it's true at all.
But no, I it's just, I don't mean to suck his dick too much. I think that's probably what's going to come off as, but I think it's always interesting to analyze the impact that individuals can actually play when it comes to this larger politics, because I think that's something that's often overlooked. We'll talk about the Imperium or, Legacy. We don't talk about, the people who actually organised this were Dran and whoever the representative of the Imperium was in that, diplomatic negotiation or whatever is going down. And that's kind of sad, because I actually really love that. I love the personal taste that Eve actually has, where if you had the ability, you could drill down and find out who made absolutely every decision that led to absolutely everything. If you had, the time and the patience and the spycraft.
He's kind of like Pro-God, where he just kind of took the gloves off and said, fuck it, we're going north, And then we're going to see that again just a week before, in present time, a week before where Villy and Short Dragon got in it around some CSM matter, and Pro God's like, fuck it, we're gonna go attack you. So I feel like there's a lot of similarities, but Elo Knight, I would say, is more driven than Pro God for sure. He has an energy sometimes that is amazing to watch.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was really interesting. Couple of other kind of things roughly to note. Just small things, or one kind of large thing, but small things. There was a gold Magnate that died early on in March. That died in Placid. That was one of only the second gold Magnate ever to die, and there's only 5 of them in existence, I believe.
I believe there should be slightly more than that, but yeah, they were given out as a result of the championship, the Amar Succession trials.
Right. So yeah, there was. I'm just reading it back. One of them was provided as a prize for the Amar trials in 2003, and then the remainder there received silver magnates. Then in the 2016 Amar trials, the winning team of Kelon Darklight, Lucian 4, Maxine Antilles, and Wasa QC all received a gold magnate, and then the other teams received silver magnates. So yeah, 5 in total gold magnates in the game. One of the rarest chips about. Only the second of them died in March to Frederick Von Hole, who, if you don't know, is a pretty notorious Black Ops hot dropper. He's incredibly dedicated to what he does. He creates new characters to kind of try and bait people into fights. He's, incredible at what he does.
Impressive notches on his belt for sure.
And the other thing that we've got on our notes here is Ctp Guards Departure.
Yeah, that was the public announcement of it, at least, happened right at the end of March, like the 29th or something like that.
His initial announcement was early on in March on the EVE Online forums. He announced that he was moving on to greater things, and that, he would still be playing EVE and kind of keeping an eye on the community. His last public appearance was Amsterdam in the last weekend of March. That was a lot of fun. That was a great weekend. And then I think he actually officially left CCP the first week of April. But yeah, just as a huge thing to happen in the EVE Online space, CCP Guard has kind of been a staple for all of the years that EVE has pretty much existed, really. First as a GM and then as a community rep. So yeah, I don't think his leaving could be understated.
I think we are forgetting one more thing, though. On March 17th, Snuffed Out had reinforced Wrecking Crew's Keepstar, and the results of that played out very interestingly for our test, who had decided to defend the Keepstar with against Snuffed Out because of something happened in January. So Legacy was coming back from the north. There, obviously, when you move back, you have suitcase supercarriers, and Snuffed Out killed Nyx and an Avatar moving through a low-sec system. And so Vili was quite upset about that. They had worked with Snuff for many years, and especially up in the northern campaign. And I believe Haiwanto said, hey, we're not, we're neutral, we're not blue. There's no reason to expect that we would be friendly here. So Vili took affront to that and defended the Keepstar, and Snuff decided that it was not worth coming in. They were rightly afraid of Test Superfleet and did not want to engage with that. And that would come to bite them at the end of March, I believe.
It's kind of just the tit for tat generally escalating between Legacy Coalition and Snuffed Out that you're pointing at there is an important factor here. And that also did have another interesting fact, which is that it brought Wrecking Crew closer to Legacy, which made Legacy less likely to intervene against Wrecking Crew in Providence, which is something that would affect the tenor of the war going forward, as historically Legacy had been more on the side of Providence being willing to help them to at least some degree. At least that was the case when I was there. And admittedly we were fighting PanFam at that time as well, but we still had the offer of assistance.
Right. So about a week later, Inner Hell, I believe in a Loki fleet, tackles some Rorquals of Legacy coalitions. I'm not sure if they're exactly Legacy coalitions or Fires coalitions, but Snuff ends up having a dread bomb close by just for that reason. This happened in Zero Tac 06F in Esoteria, and Test lost 400 billion. I believe they lost a few super carriers, as well as the Rorquals, and possibly a Titan or two. And Brisk Grubal, a notable initiative member, posted on Reddit that it was revenge on Test for blocking Snuffed out in their Keepstar kill, because throughout the latter half of 2018 and possibly into 2017, Snuff went around and killed all low-set Keepstars in the north, the west, and the south. They had killed Shadow Cartels, Keepstar that I know of right off the top of my head, but there were a few others. And so they were planning on adding Wrecking Crews to that list, and they were denied that. So that was the story from there.
All right.
Yeah, that fight was quite interesting. The Kamal Keepstar, from an Imperium point of view, we mostly went there to third party around and see what was going on. It's a big fight over a Keepstar. You never know if you're going to get some kills. You're going to get a Keepstar kill. It's good content for the line members, but as you both pointed out, the Wrecking Crew snuffed out Test kind of friction there was really the story at the time. And honestly, I always love to see people siding with Providence. It always makes me feel like, somebody's rooting for the underdog for once.
Yeah, so I have the battle report here. They lost 8 Hells and 2 Titans. And looking back at the D-scan from the Kamal fight, they were planning on going all in. I believe they had 100 Titans and 40 super carriers with fact support. So they were definitely ready, and that fight got snatched right from out under them. So they were not pleased.
Well, before we exit the month of March, I do want to wrap around a little bit and give my perspective on the whole CCP Guard leaving. Because obviously I was someone who had the pleasure of working very closely with him on the CSM, and I can say that he was absolutely integral with that. He was someone who was able to make sure that people actually attended meetings. I don't think people understand how much of a problem that actually is when you're a CSM member, is just getting people from CCP to sit down in a room and talk with you and actually set a meeting up and put some level of importance to it and actually get it recorded and actually get it attended. That kind of thing is so important to the process of actually getting things done, especially when you're not at summits. And CCP Guard was one of the few people who were able to actually arrange that. On top of that, he was also the guy who was just personally running a lot of small programs, which haven't really had anyone pick it up since. So we have things like the Community Creator Program. Previously, if you created videos or streamed or did any other, or run a fan site or anything else like that, you'd be able to get your subscription paid for by CCP as thanks, and that's dead now. There is no kind of official avenue for community support left, basically. He was important, obviously, to the CSM, as I mentioned, and he was also one of the people who were most in touch with the streaming side of EVE, so the Streamfleet kind of connection came through him. A lot of things are really broken down in the absence of someone like that, because they carry so much institutional knowledge and also institutional weight with them, that them leaving and not having time to really mentor someone into their own position and get them to where they need to be before leaving, I think is ultimately a very poor state of affairs. And it's something that CCP is going to suffer from for years to come.
Yeah, institutional knowledge, no matter where you are, the maintenance of institutional knowledge is absolutely integral to smooth running. Not only because it allows you to make sure that people are up to scratch with what you're doing now and know exactly the ins and outs, but also because it allows you to kind of remember the ways things went badly in the past and try and avoid them in the future, or at least recognize them when you're walking back into those issues. And as you say, CCP, have had issues in the past. CCP have had issues with the CSM quite significantly in the past. Not that we're going to touch on those too much here. You can go ahead and Google those if you want. And so knowing where the issues have cropped up previously would possibly have been fantastic for CCP to kind of keep track of. And I would hope that they've managed to pass on that knowledge, but I'm really not sure. We'll just have to wait and see.
All right, well, moving on to April, the biggest initial thing to hit on, I think, is this is when I think the nip actually broke in March that we talked about earlier, the nip between Legacy and Winter Coalition. But ProGod Legend officially went on Reddit and announced the war between Legacy and Fraternity. And this was announced as being casus belli, as it were, by the deployment of structures in space in Tenerifis that were in breach of the previous NIP treaty. And as such, war were declared. And I think, personally, this is probably one of the biggest moments of the year, full stop, because this is the moment where, for the first time in this year, two great powers actually declared that they were going to fight to the death over something.
Right. Looking back through this, Fraternity definitely did not feel like the good guy in this. They were intent on picking a lot of fights, or acting in a very offensive posture in the constraints that they were bound by. So it was kind of understandable when Tess said we're kind of done with this and we are going to war over this. This fight would not be quick by any means. Both entities are going to fight in each other's off time zones. So Legacy has to fight in China time zone. Fraternity has to fight in EU and US time zone, and they're not strong. So it's not something that they're just going to brawl out a few times and it's going to be over. It's going to be a very back and forth war.
Yeah, honestly, this one is a really interesting conflict because it's mostly centered around kind of the eastern area of Legacy space. Throwing the declaration of war out as ProGod did was particularly interesting because he did specifically say that this would be a protracted event. Legacy, according to ProGod at the time, had a history of knowing how to grind it out and stick it out and wear out their opponents. So the time zone issues and the issues of really trying to push in against a PanFam-backed Winter Coalition would be a long slog. He knew this going in. But as you say, the fight to the death declaration is incredible in Modern Eve. Modern Eve at the moment, within the blocks, the really big powers, is an interesting experience because obviously we all have our super capital fleets, and we all know that if we lose our super capital fleets, we won't be able to defend our home space in the current mechanics. So everyone's always a little bit cautious with their super capitals at the same time as wanting to use them and really push with them. So this was kind of the balance where, no, we're going to commit to that open front. And I was impressed by the fact that Legacy wanted to throw in everything they had at this point.
Well, they kind of knew what was at stake here. This is obviously the continuation of the Extinction War that happened in 2018 that topped off with ULAX. So it was really, Fraternity had made it clear that they were not going to suffer Legacy on their border. Even having a kind of a no man's border between the two would not be helpful. So they both kind of understood what was at stake here. So they both were prepared. Both coalitions had very deep war chests. Test would eventually have some members of PBIC coming over from Serenity. These guys would be renamed as Army of Mango, and they would be given space eventually in Faithabulous and Omist. And those guys would be very helpful in the latter part of the war, but for right now, the first opening shots are being made.
Yeah, and this was a kind of war that's being fought way out of time zone. And that would come to be a lot of a problem, because we ended up just having basically fights over either one side deploying structures in the other's space in their preferred time zone, and trying to use that as a way to A, bait a fight, or B, extend their capital range deeper into hostile territory. Or you'd have fights over like rock wars and things like that, with that kind of being the focus as both sides tried to basically cripple the other's economic engines going into this early part of the war to push people back from the front lines into Torrid and Scalding Pass and all those kind of areas, so that then eventually soft warfare could take place, because soft warfare just wasn't a possibility for Legacy to win through at this part of the war due to that time zone mismatch that you highlighted.
Right. This war would actually simmer for, I believe, for 1 or 2 months before it actually got kind of pushed up to kind of universal level news, just because it was, taking iHubs back and forth, and Tosising back and forth, kind of the unseen, much detested part of Fazisov is trying to grind through space, especially space that is completely opposite your time zone. So no one was having a good time. No one was having fun. And it's going to take a while before things actually get interesting. So at this point, I think we can mention the Quiet War that had been, it's for some reports going on for the better part of 2 years now. The conflict was just kind of between NC.'s rental empire, Brothers of Tangra, that it shared with Pandemic Legion, but Space and Ethereum Reach in the Spire seem to have been under constant attack from the Ethereum Breach Coalition, which was Laserhawks, Unspoken, Outspoken, Just a Game, and a few others. I believe Promethean Alliance was on the other side of this, aiding Northern Coalition a few times. Well, Northern Coalition would aid them. But yes, April was a horrible month for Northern Coalition. It lost somewhere up from 6 Fortizars, 2 Sotios, 2 Asbels, 2 Tataras, and 20 Athenors. And just looking at that is a huge chunk of industrial structures and income generation for NC. Well, for the renters to pay NC. So they were being hit pretty hard in that area. They did have a few wins. Northern Coalition destroyed Unspoken, and I believe in F9 Tech FUV. They had lost only 20 billion to the Imperium, 60 billion. Horde actually helped quite well in that fight. They camped in Pala, which is the low-sec entrance into Ethereum Reach, and were cutting off Imperium reinforcements. Back in January, Northern Coalition, or actually Pandemic Legion, had baited out two Laserhawk Nyxes and an Avatar, as they were scouted to have been reinforcing random structures just on their own, or the two Nyxes. So they had baited that, and that was quite a happy fight for those guys. But yeah, so it's still going on. I'm not sure when it ends. And it's kind of hard to actually do research on this because it's, again, at very odd hours of the day, you have a lot of Russian entities that aren't very active, like on Reddit or things. So you're basically just trying to piece together battle reports, trying to figure out what's going on. Unspoken would eventually leave the area later in the year, but you have entities kind of falling off the radar and coming back, every few weeks. So it's very difficult to actually get a good grasp of what's going on. But but that is what I do know is Laserhawks had been looking for SOV or forming their own rental pockets, and were constantly antagonizing bot lords.
All right, and another huge change that we had in April was CCP driven, and this is kind of, I guess, a response to something that you mentioned that you called, what do you call it? I believe that the Extinction War is what you called it, January. I personally call it the Continuation War, and that's just the large, very super capital focused war that went down in 2018. That's never really had an official name because I don't know why, it just hasn't seemed to stick in the memory of the player base in the way a lot of previous wars have.
Well, that's the funny thing about being able to write stories about this is there's so many southern conflicts or northern conflicts that I'm kind of forced to pick a name for it. Otherwise, that those other names are so ambiguous, they could really mean anything. So doing some research, there was a few times that it was the Holy Meteorite Coalition, or HRE, that was formed in 2017. So the Extinction War being, the Holy Meteorite is going to cause a war, and the war of extinction for the dinosaurs. So I think that's the meme that started. But I always thought it was kind of clever, because tests are dinosaurs. So I kind of rolled with it.
Yeah, well, in that we saw a lot of really big, super stalematey fights, as basically BTAC R5's capital meta kind of just played out again, but more. And you just saw blocks of super capitals sit opposite one another and just trade Doomsdays at one another, or alternatively just Doomsday a ton of faxes. And that was kind of the extent of the meta. That's kind of not the extent of the meta, obviously. There's a lot of nuance to it, a lot of positional play that goes into it, but people felt like it wasn't dynamic and it wasn't particularly fun. And especially it was felt that people just weren't dying enough in these large fights, just due to the power of faxes and a lot of other reasons that made effectively only alpha matter.
Yeah, this was felt a lot of the time in that 2018 kind of summerish conflict area. Obviously, we had UALX kind of twice, but the big UALX fight was Legacy and the Imperium against PanFam. Everyone dropped supers. Everyone was doomsdaying each other, and by the end of that conflict, so that little fight, we were talking about server stability a lot more than we were talking about who are we going to be shooting? How do we keep the servers stable? How do we keep the servers up? And you mentioned the BTAC-R kind of comparisons. We were actually asking subcapital pilots to log off to try and reduce the load on the system at the time in order to keep it stable. This was a thing that happened in BTAC-R as well. People kept the subcapitals out of the BTAC-R system in order to try and keep it stable. So, time is a circle, as we mentioned earlier, that kind of happened. And then there was the whole bit with I can't remember which particular keep star it was during the Imperium's assault on Fade and Pureblind. It may have been while I pull up Dotlan. It may have been X47 actually, in which the Doomsday Bug kind of became apparent. Effectively, if you Doomsday with a Titan a target and that target dies, then your cooldown on the Doomsday doesn't actually start. That 5-minute non-tether, non-move, what have you, doesn't start. And so you will immediately retether after the module cycles. And that was kind of a thing that the Imperium had to battle against in, I think, the second X47 fight over the armor timer. And so, yeah, this kind of capital, super capital meta really was becoming quite stagnant for the game, quite negative for the game. And I think this patch was an attempt by CCP to really try and readdress that.
Well, let's talk about this patch before we actually going into the meeting for it. What actually?
There were kind of two major components to it. And the first of those is a huge change just to how remote reps work in general. And now, before this patch, reps didn't have any sort of stacking penalty and there was no limit to them. If you put 100 reps on a target, it would do 100 times that amount of rep. There would be no stacking penalty, it would just do it. And after this patch, that is no longer the case. I can't quote the exact maths, but it's effectively an extreme diminishing returns near the end of what is feasible to really put remote repairs on. So if you put, something like 24 capital remote reps on something, the 25th is only going to be doing 30 to 40% as much as the first one did. And that is huge, because when you get to these fights where you've got literal hundreds of Titans and hundreds of facts, the fact that every Titan now does its flat DPS and the reps of the facts don't scale as much, that does allow you to actually just start to brute force Titans once you've got facts down, the facts numbers down low enough, which is just something that isn't possible because a fax would otherwise out-rep, just in terms of flat EHP a second, a Titan's DPS on a well-tanked Titan.
It's kind of that question that's been happening with autocannons and blasters a lot as well. These are hugely high DPS weapons, but when you take them into a fleet fight, they become much less of a force multiplier, because once reps can be applied, it's either a question of you have more DPS to chew through than the reps applied, or you don't. And if you don't, then the target doesn't die. And so this was kind of moving that balance back towards this, where DPS applied would kind of incrementally creep until a target dies. And I think that was quite positive. That's my personal opinion on this. But this patch also did a few other things as well. So high-angle weapons for Titans and Dreadnaughts. So these are effectively short-range capital weapons that have really high tracking so that they can kill sub-capitals quite easily. The damage multiplier for these high-angle weapons was reduced by 50%, but Dreadnaughts would not have a damage reduction because their siege module had an additional bonus for the damage of these modules. Other capital changes were to light and heavy fighters to decrease their damage application in various ways. And also, this was the patch that introduced the networked sensor array warp changes. So the networked sensor array, a module that's used on carriers and supercarriers. These are ships that are very often used in order to do high-end nullsec ratting in order for making income. And so yeah, that module, when it was activated, would immediately increase the sensor strength of the ship that it's fitted to, allowing you to lock frigates in 2 or 3 seconds and battleships in less than a single second. That module, following this patch, would also mean that you cannot warp while it was active. So if you go into a site, you hit your network sensor array, you start locking targets up, and suddenly a hostile lands on you. Even if you're aligned out, your network sensor array is on, you can't warp. That target can now tackle you as a carrier or a supercarrier, and potentially bring in other friends to kill you. It really put these pilots at not a huge amount more risk, especially under nullsec super cap umbrellas, but a little bit more risk, which really they needed to be.
Right. And I believe it's in addition to all of that, fighters got somewhere between a 15%. Actually, let me check my notes before I say something wrong, because we all know how wrong I can be. But anyways, fighters got a nerf to explosion radius and explosion velocity. So I believe it was like 15 or 30% for one and the other. But it definitely helped with fighters being very oppressive in subcapital battles.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to just say that this was something that was done very much between the CSM and a couple of developers in CCP, and you don't often, and obviously we were shouted out in this article in the dev blog, but no one reads the dev blog, so that's fine. But I do want to say that this is an example of the kind of areas where, especially in things like the NSA change, those are things that were very specifically pointed out and pushed for by the CSM when we came to when CCP came to us with kind of a, hey, we want to nerf capitals, we want to make this super capital kind of engagement meta better, help us do that. And these were the kind of suggestions that we were giving them, ways that made more PvP happen, because that was very clearly CCP's goal, and that was a goal that we were happy to kind of facilitate. And this is the kind of value that the CSM does add to EVE Online. Just saying there. Vote when it happens next year, please, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. The CSM is great, and the interesting thing about this patch is that it was a positive patch, right? It was mostly good for what for a starting point on these new ships. On these new metas of engagement and the way that we were using capitals at the time. But I think the most interesting thing about this patch is how much it didn't do at the very end of the day. It was a really interesting patch. Everyone thought that this would have a huge impact, but really, it, as we would see later on, it didn't really change anything.
Well, that's kind of debatable. It probably headed off something that was more unsustainable if they had not, intervened. But to say that perhaps people just brought, an extra fax or something, an extra super carrier, it's hard to tell, really. You honestly have to look at what could have happened if they didn't. But I wouldn't say that nothing happened, but because it's hard to look at alternative.
I'll yield my comment to, it didn't do anything significant against the blocks that were really proliferating capital use in the first place.
Right. I would say that's true. And this was not only aimed at PvP capitals at all, because the Rorqual got a pretty significant nerf. The panic module, the duration was shortened. The bonus to shield booster from the industrial core was reduced. Mining yields for mining drones and ice drones were reduced. So yeah, it was kind of a across the board general reduction in the efficiency of Rorquals and the kind of the PvP sting of super carriers and titans.
All right, well, with that subject over, I'm going to hand introducing this to someone else in the call, because it's not something that I can really discuss for legal reasons.
Right. So, yeah, the final big thing that really was significant, although not in the ways that, not in a gameplay manner, was the Fountain 3. Otherwise known as the banning of CSM member Brisk Rubal and initiative leadership Panduralica and Darkshines. This happened, let me just find the exact date. This happened on the 8th of April. This was posted by CCP Dopamine. According to the dev blog, Brisk Rubal was found to be sharing confidential information that led to illicit in-game transactions. That's a direct quote. This kind of had a few impacts. One, Brisk Rubal was immediately removed from CSM 13. There were bans for all 3 members that I previously mentioned, and yeah, it was really a crazy couple of weeks surrounding this. Brisk immediately responded to CCP, saying that these were completely false allegations and that he was going to fight back against this. Later on, I think it was roughly a week later, CCP announced that that they were reviewing the ban and that they would provide further updates. And on April 25th, Brisk Rubal and Panduralica and Darkshines all had their accounts reinstated, and basically their names cleared. CCP had reviewed the evidence available, and I quote a further dev blog, that it is now clear that CCP's initial actions were based on unsubstantiated assumptions. Now, I'm not going to comment on unsubstantiated assumptions or not, but this was kind of a crazy up and down week, or 3, as it turned out to be. It was mentioned on practically every single talk show episode across that period of time. I know it was mentioned on Open Comms basically every week. Open Comms, obviously, Brisk Rubal is a host there, but also on the Push to Talk show, on the Meta show. I assume even on a good chunk of Talking in Stations episodes. This was a defining moment in the year, and it was felt among the 3 of us that this was worth really just kind of mentioning, as CCP did a thing that really did not go well for them, and that is significant.
Well, yeah, when you accuse, a high-profile CSM member of doing something without really doing a thorough investigation on it, it really bites you in the rear end later. And this is pretty much exactly what happened. Everyone got their, Brisk got his reputation destroyed. A lot of feelings were hurt, and definitely a lot of trust between probably. And I can only say this as someone not on the CSM, but I can imagine a whole lot of trust was lost between the CSM and CCP, and it's already kind of an interesting situation already. Without having that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would go a little bit further than to say trust between CCP and the CSM, and say trust between CCP and the community. Because there was obviously this question at the time of, well, if this can happen to a high-profile member of the CSM who, his accounts are monitored in order to make sure that he's not doing what CCP accused him of and then had to retract, how are the ordinary players who get banned sometimes without any idea what the hell they did supposed to kind of try and get any sort of recourse on that? And I think it's very interesting that CCP did make that issue, but also, as you said, the trust question is huge. And I think that leads into further issues potentially for CCP later on in the year that we'll talk about a little bit later.
I know for a fact we had a few people come out on TIS, not on the show, but in Discord and within DM saying, hey, the same thing happened to me. My accounts were banned. I have no idea why. I can't even file appeal. I can't get a GM to talk to me. I basically I was forcibly quit the game. And I have no idea why. I lost all my friends, I lost my corporation, my alliance, and it is really sad to see how Brisk got lucky because he was really famous. And there's a lot of people that had the same thing happen to them, probably some fake allegations or something that, a GM didn't even look into and just banned, and it's really sad.
And as is tradition for me on the topic, no comment. So in May, moving over, we have kind of the biggest, what I think is at least one of the biggest moments, is the kind of finalization of a formal relationship between Legacy and the Army of Mangoes. And now Army of Mangoes, for those of you who don't know, are the Tranquility version of PIBC, the most dominant Chinese group on the Chinese server of Serenity, who moved over to Tranquility following their final basically victory on the Serenity server, and which led to basically all of their rivals deciding to move to Tranquility rather than continuing to fight over there.
It's also worth noting, just real quick, that they were kind of forced to move over if they wanted to continue playing EVE, because Serenity was actually shut down under the expiration of the previous licensing agreement and a new licensing agreement that CCP agreed with NetEase that is actually still in the works while they work with the Chinese government to figure out what the hell is going on.
Yeah, it's currently still in a beta mode, so you can actually play on Serenity, but all of your progress is wiped each month. Which means it's not EVE.
That seems really weird, but moving on.
It still gets about 700 players, peak a day. It's been fascinating. I keep tabs and stuff like that. But yeah, anyway, previously the regions of Featherbolus and Omist had been under the control of Russian subsidiary renters of Legacy. They were technically independent, but they paid Legacy money to not get kicked out, so they were renters for all, effective means. They just had an actual leadership structure that wasn't a joke. Although it turned out to be a complete joke, because when they stopped paying their rent, Legacy decided to remind them by removing them very quickly, and that led to Army of Mangoes being put in their place. So we had this cradle for a new Chinese organization. At the time, a lot of people weren't sure how impactful this was going to be, but it would end up being something that was of great importance to Legacy, because this allowed them to foster effectively a Chinese time zone alliance early on and bring them in whilst they were relatively young on the political scene and relatively low SP, and give them a place to build up so that they could then use them to later on actually effectively impact this war.
For sure.
What do you guys think about it, though? Are there any other comments on Army of Mangoes coming in? I know when people heard that they were moving, there was a lot of like really rampant paranoia that, oh shit, they're going to just take over the game immediately because there's so many of them, and that really did not happen.
No, Tranquility is very different from Singularity, as it's much less homogeneous. So the culture, one culture cannot get a foothold basically in the game. There's all these opposing time zones, opposing cultures, opposing ways of thinking that acts like a kind of natural wildfire that kind of burns down anybody that gets too big or I don't know. It's basically, yeah, it's like a lawnmower basically, for the most part. And so the fears were kind of overblown for sure. We have yet to see their full potential. We don't know exactly what they're going to do. For right now, they are content to be kind of on opposite sides of each other. You have Veni Vidi Vici with Northern Coalition. You have Ranger Regiment and Siberian Squads with GOTG. You have PLA and Goonswarm. And now you have Army of Mango with Tess. So these guys...
And obviously not to discount Fraternity and the Winter Coalition, who Fraternity especially also, it must be noted, came from Serenity originally.
That's right. So while these guys were all in... Well, I know for sure that Ranger Regiment and Fraternity were losers of the PBIC war on Singularity. Most of the other ones were friends, and so this kind of split is kind of interesting. I'm not sure exactly how they plan to move forward with it, but for right now, they're just content living in separate regions of space, and just kind of working with their kind of host coalition, I would say.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty reasonable. In much the same way as Fire did earlier on in the year, Army of Mango kind of came in. Legacy offered them kind of a rough alignment without any other real strings attached. Just here's a couch, and you guys can get your bearings, and we will see how the relationship plays out. So,
I think they gave them way more than a couch. I think it was more like a separate bedroom. Just be like, here's a whole entire region, kind of do whatever you want. They probably had some deal like they couldn't. I know that kind of a subclause was that they could not attack Fraternity. They could only show up with Legacy to defend. There were some restrictions, but it was not anything really critical. For the most part, they just ratted away in Omist and built up their super force.
Yeah, so Legacy are really appearing to be this year kind of the group that is trying to develop new potential coalitions, and honestly, I think that's only positive. We need more players in the game. We need more big players that can kind of join the big boys meta gameplay and really cause a disruption here. So I look forward to seeing what Army of Mango do going into 2020, honestly.
Yeah, I think their leader, well, not their leader, but one of their big military directors, Fulcrum, is someone who I've had the pleasure of being able to sit down and talk to a lot. And he is a very interesting guy. He's got very interesting aims, and one of the most interesting parts about Army of Mangoes is that they don't see Tranquility as their final destination. They effectively see this as kind of a holiday, so they are just going to some degree, feel free to cause chaos, because they don't intend to stay here forever, unlike maybe Fraternity or some of the members of Winter.
Yeah, one of the most intriguing aspects of Fulcrum and his experience with Eve is actually his history, because I'm sure a lot of people won't be aware of this, but Fulcrum is previously a Tranquility player who moved over to the Serenity server a few years back. He was one of the driving forces behind the Rooks and Kings Alliance, who pioneered pipe bombing and a few other mechanics that other groups have struggled to really perfect and manage in the same way as Rooks and Kings ever did. So he has experience on Tranquility with the gameplay and the metagame. He went to Serenity, found that he really enjoyed it, found that, he could do some new things over there as well, and now he's back on Tranquility for a while. So it'll be really interesting to see what Army of Mango can do, especially with that kind of experience in the Leadership Council.
So, Dirk, something really important or something big really was announced in May. Perhaps you could speak on that?
Which bit are you discussing here? There's a couple of bits in our notes.
Oh my gosh, how can you not know this? It was the State of the Union by the Magnate.
Ah, right. The glassing of tribute. Yeah. So in May, it was kind of decided that the Imperium would go north. We hadn't had a significant conflict in a while. We'd been getting hit and hit and hit by groups like Peanut Smash and the Delve Pest Control guys, who count a number of PanFam members among their organization. And what with the accusations against Brisk Rubal that later came to light as being partially fueled by Peanut Smash, who was, at the time, I believe, still a member of Pandemic Legion with his Corp Elitist Ops.
I believe, no, he was very firmly and snuffed out at this point.
Okay, I will take your word for that. Again, my memory is not that great on that specific detail, but yeah, we decided that we would deploy to the north to tribute, to burn it all to the ground. This was the stated objective: go in, burn the infrastructure, salt the fields, and kind of come home again. This was initially discussed on the 11th on the fireside and also the meta show there. We did a rather subdued State of the Union a week later on the 18th. That was particularly interesting because State of the Union is generally quite a bombastic affair. It's an event where Mitani will, as he would say, hurf a lot of bluffs, really try and get the troops fired up and kind of make sure that everyone knows what the objectives are. This time he tried not to kind of hype it up so much. He tried to keep things quite low key so that, potentially we would try a little bit more of a psychological aspect to the State of the Union. And we still deployed north with the largest Titan fleet the game has ever seen. I think on that first day, we moved more than 1,000 Titans and numerous other capitals and sub-capitals. A week later, we ended up in KQK, having anchored a fresh keep star in KQK. And yeah, it was an interesting time because when we went there, we were literally going to just, as I say, burn the region to the ground and salt the fields. We wanted to hear screams, we wanted to hear pain, and we weren't really worried about how we got that.
Introduce mandatory "this is a goon spin" warning before someone cries in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, this is the I'm here as an Imperium news editor, I'm here as a diplomat. We had our objectives, and these were, what we were aiming to do. We absolutely, just as a thing that I feel like I need to say here, we absolutely were not looking to have what happened occur. We wanted to have some fights. We wanted to make sure that, our line members were getting the fun that they deserve, because regardless of the spats of leadership of coalitions and the grudges that we use to justify our wars, we're all trying to make sure that our line members have a good time and want to continue playing this game. So we were hoping that there would be a bunch of fights. That didn't exactly happen.
Right. I think we had a chat, I believe, last Sunday with DJ Aldard, one of the FCs for Pandemic Legion, and he talked about that. Basically, they knew about a week before that this was going to happen. Tribute is a very difficult region to defend, just because of its location. It's very easy to attack it via low sec, and the relationship between Northern Coalition, Guardians of the Galaxy, had kind of fallen apart, and there was a kind of, I would say, some upset feelings. People, instead of working out a proper campaign for it, just kind of decided to take their ball and go home. So, coupled with the fact that the North was not in a very good position to defend, and Tribute, the heart of Northern Coalition space, is very difficult to defend, they decided to unanchor what they could, save what they could, and move back east.
That's something that hasn't quite happened yet, because right now we're still at the point where no one's even really clashed. We've just had, the figureheads of the Mittani come out and say, we're going to go north, we're going to get this done. And PanFam actually had a lot of time. We did see GSO obviously put down staging, and structures were scattered around the place, and PanFam had to rush to try and hit those, but it did give PanFam their own time whilst the Imperium was moving their own strategic assets north to relocate their own strategic assets. And they did, as you said, concentrate their force into Tribute, specifically in the system of SH1. And their hope was just to try and present a bulwark and stop you guys, and make it a kind of another, I suppose, another time like the Continuation War, where it just became such a slug that neither side could really win objectives particularly fast, and maybe they could stop you there, bore you out, make you go home, and decide the deployment wasn't worth it. And they did have a couple of successes, at least partially, in the vein of at least defending. A headshot was attempted in SH1 pretty much like a couple of weeks after landing.
It was basically immediately, actually. It wasn't even a couple of weeks. It was one of the Keepstar in KQK went down on the 24th, and we had reinforced that iHub as almost one of the first things we did in the first few days. The major battle surrounding the SH1 iHub, pretty much the only major force and conflict. There was one other big fight during that conflict, but this was by far the defining moment. That took place on the 31st, only like 3 or 4 days later. So we were immediately in for the headshot just to see if it would work out.
And obviously it didn't here.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. We ended up being drawn into a protracted slugfest. What effectively occurred was that during that fight, there was a question at some point of whether or not we would be able to get there. We bridged to the closest system we could, but the entire SH1 constellation, all of the surrounded systems were drag bubbled and delay bubbled to hell. And so, yeah, ultimately we decided that we would just drop our battleship fleet in, have a brawl, get Doomsday, and go home. And from there on, the glassing of tribute took on very much more of a deliberate process. We started pushing in from our staging of KQK and just taking it as a kind of wave rather than trying to focus on areas the other side of tribute. And that really did yield the results for the glassing, but it kind of served also to stifle any major fights that could have been had. Time zone tanking, unfortunately, is a mechanic that we just have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important to highlight the importance of IHUPs and why it's very important that you don't want them falling into enemy hands. The reason why that battle was so... the reason why the North won that battle is because the system was sino-jammed. So Goonswarm had to bring their capitals in through gates, which is extremely vulnerable, especially in this age of dread bombs. So holding on to that IHUP is very important. And it's something that alliances will fight over more than pretty much anything else. Keep stars are kind of just the big juicy things that everyone likes to see, but the down in the trenches fighting is over IHUPs because they control SOV upgrades and those Sino-jammers.
Yeah, the Keep Star kill is basically the big juicy light at the end of the tunnel in any sort of assault on home space.
They can also be used offensively, as we've seen previously from example like at the time Guardians of the Galaxy invasion of the DRF back in, I believe it was 2018, just before the start of the continuation war, where they
dropped in MTO2.
Yes.
Yeah. That was a really interesting fight, actually, especially with the way the DRF attempted to defend against it.
Yeah, with the Manfrestidious suicide dreads.
That was a great fight.
Yeah, talking about going, tangents again to history. But
I love it, to be honest.
Whilst all these fights were going on and all of these empires were were kind of at war with each other, it's not been a world war this year. Because whilst you had this little fight in the southeast between Legacy and Winter Coalition, you also had this fight between the Imperium and PanFam, and there wasn't much friction between them two, and you didn't really see Legacy get involved in the north. You didn't say Imperium get involved in the south a huge amount, which is how these kind of operations had previously gone. In fact, this is pretty much the same size as 2018, just separated into two completely separate wars, if you think about it. But we still saw an actual diplomatic agreement being reached between three of these nullsec powers, Legacy, the Imperium, and PanFam, over something which caused a war that we talked about right up in December, and that was the Perimeter Trade War. So between Pandemic Horde and predominantly Test Alliance Please Ignore over the ownership of the Perimeter Keepstar. And this was an agreement between the Imperium, Legacy, and PanFam to work together to defend this one Keepstar and then all share the profits from it, effectively forming a political hegemony over HiSec. Is that you think a fair assessment of the situation?
I mean, I was not involved in any way. I just heard about it, but Dirk could probably speak more on it. But I know it was probably the best agreement that any one entity could hope for, because Horde being in Geminate would literally just drop Asbels until the end of time, and would constantly be reinforcing that Keepstar. So that was their best option for keeping the Keepstar in perimeter, and they weren't going to get as big of a slice, but it was something that all three of them could equally agree on.
Yeah, so I kind of feel like I've dominated talking about May a lot, which is why I kind of wanted to give Jen you a chance to comment first there. But this was a really interesting agreement because obviously Test had been fighting there. Legacy and the Imperium kind of have a handshake deal over various regions of the game in terms of if one is being attacked, we'll go and defend the other. We were only really involved in HiSec as a fun way to get fights that were guaranteed. You know, turn up in ships that are inexpensive, shoot some people that we like to shoot, and get some kills. But the sheer amount of time that this was happening over was significant for Legacy, absolutely, and was significant for PanFam. So this was important for more than just one reason. It wasn't just the fact that Test had dropped a keep star and were making money from it. This was the first incursion into HiSec from the nullsec empires.
I would kind of disagree there because Pandemic Horde had been dominating that perimeter income stream for a very long time. They had a Fortizar, I believe, at Planet 5, and that was the place that you sold injectors and plex at. So Test had saw that and wanted to get in on it. Their Keepstar dropping in October of 2018 was kind of like the final word because of the defensible structure of it. And then so Pandemic Horde, seeing their income cut off, basically decided to make themselves as much of a nuisance as possible, and they finally had to hash agreement down.
I'll rephrase that then. This was the first real time that a nullsec conflict had spilled over into HiSec. Nullsec enmities had spilled over into HiSec, and
for sure
were remaining in HiSec as well. There were a couple of points during the Hakonnen deployment way back in 2017 where the Imperium went to Hakonnen and tried to fight under a supercapital umbrella without any supercapitals of our own. That went about as well as you might expect. But we killed a Fortizar back then. It was a hell of a grind. And so nobody really wanted to do it. And then Tess came in, dropped this Keepstar. This spawned a 6-month long, by the end of it, back and forth. The Keepstar and perimeter was reinforced into armor 4 times, 5 times, something like that. And so this agreement at the very end of the day was a way to see peace in HiSec, so that the nullsec empires didn't have to worry about war deck mechanics and who can we shoot, who can't we shoot. Do people have high enough security status to go into HiSec to shoot people? That's a bigger aspect of nullsec FCing than you might expect when you're looking at going to HiSec. And so it also had the advantage, being a profit-sharing agreement, as Villy posted to Reddit, of giving all of the involved parties some extra money in their war chests to bring to the nullsec fighting. And so it's kind of an agreement in one place so that we can all hit each other in the faces with super capitals a bit more elsewhere.
So one thing I think we should mention, and I think we probably should have done this around the Mittani announcing the return to tribute, is there was a D-scan that went around that showed an absolute amount of super carriers and Titans. I believe the final count was 322 Titans, 237 super carriers, and 308 Force auxiliaries. The snapshot was taken in a Blackrise system of Coruscant, and on their way to probably the 6R C Keepstar and Cloud Ring. So undoubtedly Goonswarm was ready to go, and that D-scan was just kind of like just, I don't know, the warning shot across the bow of PanFam that the Imperium were coming.
Yeah, as I mentioned, as I was talking about it earlier, I did say, more than 1,000 Titans were moved from Delve to 6RCQ over the course of those move-ups, and that snapshot that you're mentioning there is absolutely the first day, pretty much. We were talking about, 5-6 fleets worth of super capitals moving through the system one at a time, and then the other capital support as well. It's I think earlier on I mentioned it as the biggest move up around, the biggest move up in Eve, and I think I stand by that, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's a huge thing for me. I honestly think this is candidate for one of the biggest changes in 2019. That might be a bit of a bold one because it's not a big war, a big patch, a big change to the game, but really like control over what effectively is the legalized RMT market being agreed upon by the three major military powers of EVE Online. That's pretty interesting in its own way. Just the fact that all of those three people can see that it's mutually beneficial for them to work with it, and we get this kind of like little agreement that we're all going to dominate the plebeians, and it'll be interesting to see if any of those three founding organizations end up getting kicked out of it. Like, that's going to be the real question for me, is like, does Legacy and PanFam eventually move to take the Imperium out of the deal, or this feels like it could be an objective for years and years to come now?
I think you're right, and I think the way I would kind of liken it is it's the pre-tremor, almost. The agreement was the thing that kind of warns you that something else is coming. But we're 6 months down the line now, and nobody's still quite sure whether or not the big thing that we thought was coming, that it was indicating, has actually hit yet. And I don't think it has. I think we're still waiting to see the next big thing, and whether or not it will be created by the Tranquility Trading Agreement, or if it will be something that has an impact on the Tranquility Trading Agreement. It could be that there's a new casino war tomorrow, and everyone moves to take out the Imperium, and that happens. I'm not sure it will, but it could be that occurs, and that would probably have an impact on the Tranquility Trading aspect without being caused by it. So, yeah, everything kind of seems to be becoming more and more interconnected recently.
Can I introduce you to the Null First Discord?
I think we can touch on Null First towards the end of June, but let's definitely segue into June as a kind of an extension of the Glassing of the North. Deadco turns on PanFam. Now, Jin, I know you wanted to talk a bit about this.
Yeah, this is something that will end up coming back around in, right again, not in December, but in like kind of very late November. And that is Deadco taking the opportunity of PanFam having moved all of their attention towards Tribute, towards facing the Imperium, towards this one fight, and Deadco seeing that and thinking, oh, well, they're probably not going to be able to defend this northeastern part of Tribute that we've wanted for a while, but we kind of let them have at the end of, not even World War B, I don't think, it was at the end of the pet wars between Deadco and the Imperium. I think that was just the redrawn borders that ended up getting assigned, but I digress, I haven't researched that. Anyway, they used that to just fully break out, gain control of Eastern Tenal for Ranger Regiment. And there was effectively very little resistance here to it. There was nothing that NC. Could reasonably do, and we already seen the attacks on the Renter Empire from the Quiet War just be left almost unanswered by NC. And because of that, the local forces there were just so weak that they just fell immediately under the weight of an actual coalition.
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right there. Deadco took advantage of PanFam's distraction. At this point, PanFam were retreating further into Tribute, and then from Tribute into Vale of the Silent, and then from Vale of the Silent all the way over to Malpass later on. And they were absolutely focused on withdrawing their assets, minimizing losses. They didn't want to fight on two fronts against either the biggest superpower in the game in terms of super capitals on their doorstep, and then obviously Dead Coalition, not an insignificant super capital force in and of itself.
Yeah, so for June, 4 Keepstars from Northern Coalition, or from the North, were killed. The Imtaco EE8 Keepstar, which I believe that brings that system, for the record of Keepstar kills, I believe that's the third one. OTAC Y, P3EN, and SH1.
And during this period, though, we did see a continued slowing down of the Southeastern War. Whilst things were really heating up in the north, and we saw these moves from Deadco, we saw Tino getting taken, we saw continuing fights over these Keepstars in the north, we saw actually pretty little going on in the southeast. Things were just continuing to fight over ADMs. There wasn't much Sov being taken at this point. In fact, I think at this point Detorid was still 100% under Winter Coalition control, and we're 2.5 months into the war now.
I think people looking back are really going to underestimate how much of a grind this was.
Yeah.
You would not have these big giant splashy wins. You would have 50 billion, 20 billion, 10, 15 on each side. It was really just getting a conflict, getting a win in while you could, and dancing around those time zones that were very difficult to fight in.
Yeah, and this was something that was kind of mirrored in the glassing as well. I know, January, you pulled up Tuzzy's spreadsheet earlier on of the amount of damage that was inflicted across Tribute and Vale of the Silent. And a lot of it is in largely uncontested structures. $1 billion here, 2 billion here, 10 billion here, and just these little things that get knocked over that slowly add up over the course of weeks and months to be hundreds of billions, trillions of ISK. But there's never one defining moment. And I know we were discussing this beforehand. This is kind of the way warfare in EVE Online has gone.
It really is now. It's less about the big keystone battle where you're going to win this objective and win the war, or you're going to lose this objective and lose the war. Now it really is a 10-round UFC just death match, if you want to go to war, because all of these organizations now are so well founded and so strong because they've been around for so long and they've dealt with so many failures and so many defeats that they're no longer these empires that are fragile. They are just organizations that have dealt with so many blows before that they just know how to take them and know how to sit there and try and grind out a war against one another. So you have these real veteran entities with years upon years upon years of knowledge of how to fight these things, just pressing up against one another and just seeing who's going to break first. And I love it. I gotta say, I love it.
Right. So I really like those mountains and valleys analogy to describe the universe of EVE. And going up against a mountain, you basically, it's like watching a crust, from the Earth's mantle. It takes millions of years for one plate to slide underneath another. And just an inch a year. That's all you get is an inch a year. So it's the same way when these super coalitions go to war. Is you only get a little bit at a time. So it's a long, slow game. Both of these guys have massive amounts of ISK to throw at things. Both of them have their best FCs out. So both of them are intending to win, and they are going to see this to the end.
Yeah, and especially during the northern conflict, even if they don't win, even if they don't fight back as much, there's nothing for them to take. We weren't dropping structures as we move further into tribute. There wasn't anything for them to come back at us about. So it wasn't that the Imperium wouldn't win. It was that Northern Coalition PanFam wouldn't lose. They wouldn't lose their super capitals. They wouldn't really lose their capitals. Structures are almost throwaway at this point. It's pretty much assured when you drop down a keep star that you will probably, unless it's in the middle of a very defensible region, not be able to unanchor and scoop it back up again. Especially, if somebody comes for you in a conflict, there's never going to be a point at which you're recovering that asset. So their fire and forget missiles is another analogy, and you kind of write that off from the start. So it's really more about not losing.
Yeah, and I guess we'll get to talk a little bit about what goes into that, but do you feel like this move to the east was successful for, or at least this ability to retreat was successful from NC? Do you feel like they did the best they could have done in the situation, or were there real mistakes, someone who fought on the front lines of it? It'd be nicer if we could have like a member of BL here to talk about it, but whatever.
For sure. I think they got the best scenario that they could have hoped for. They lost approximately 4.2 trillion in structures. This amount would absolutely cripple anybody smaller, but they just kind of looked at it as, this is what the blood sacrifice we have to make, then we'll do it. They're in a much better position in the drone lands. As you can see now, they have regrouped and have headed back out to GOTG space. But from my perspective, they did well. I mean, they're not dead at all. Now you can go into the nuances of, corpse leaving, inactivity, stuff like that. But that's really tangential to the fact that they had saved their core identity. And they have, I don't think 4.2 trillion is anything to them, so, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, 4.2 trillion is nothing to be sniffed at. But again, these are the things that you have to kind of accept. Once you throw that down, if somebody comes for you, you're not getting it back. So it's one of those things of, that asset is down, now it's written off, we're not going to worry about it again. I think I wouldn't say necessarily that it worked for them or that it was a good decision, but I would also say that it wasn't a bad decision. It was the only decision that they had left. In much the same way as the drone region federations, when the Holy Rental Empire came for them, moving was the only decision they had left. And so had they stayed and fought it out, they would have lost far more in terms of super capital assets, but they would have also lost a lot more in the future following their move to the drone lands, because they would have lost their ability to defend that space with a super capital umbrella. And that is an advantage in nullsec that you can't overstate. The ability to just drop, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of DPS onto a grid in a matter of moments is incredibly powerful and will wipe out basically anything that comes at you. So yeah, there's a question about whether or not alliances in nullsec should be able to lose, tens of titans without worrying about it. Should they be easier to replace? Should they be cheaper? Should they be less powerful so that you don't have to ensure that you're maintaining your own supercapital umbrella? These are all questions that I hope CCP are thinking about. But yeah, at the end of the day, PanFam made the only decision that really they could ever have made, and I don't blame them for it. I think it's worked out for them in terms of their rebuilding. I'm aware that Pandemic Horde has apparently recently announced a Titan construction / purchase subsidy program or something. They'll pay for about 10% of your Titan if you pay for the rest, kind of deal. So it appears to be working for them. They appear to be looking at, making themselves into an even bigger superpower than they are now. I can't see how it's gone badly for them at the very least, beyond having to move all of that time and lose all of the assets in space.
Well, NC Dot is a very old and very established coalition. So they are no strangers to having to pick up and relocate. And they have done this many, 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 many times. And the fact that they could have, I'm not even like hyperbolic here, as they probably have a near infinite ISK reserve, makes things much easier.
Well, following that, we had a little bit more of a sad event, which was the disbanding of Skill Yourself, which were probably one of the key alliances in 2017. Well, not even 2017, sorry, in 2018, being the ones to slay the DRF and really shake up the northeast of the map and eventually get deeply involved in the continuation war, which we talked about as being one of the big drivers of 2018. But following that, they really struggled. We talked about their deployment in the southeast to the Legacy Winter War that was going on. But as you could hear, as Winter got more and more involved in the war, and Legacy and Legacy and FI.RE got more and more involved in the war, it feels like they just found that their gameplay style was working less and less. What they were trying to do just wasn't as effective against a real empire as it was, sorry, not against a real empire, but against the way that Legacy is set up versus how the DRF was set up. The DRF was very much a more decentralized, less militarized coalition that they were attacking in multiple places, and it doesn't feel like the same opportunity for gameplay that they really enjoyed was to be found against Legacy, and that drove them into inactivity. And eventually, as the game stagnated and they felt the war going in the same direction that it had in 2018, which was really, really bad. I know for a fact that, speaking to a bunch of the members at the time, that they absolutely hated that whole war, especially when it got to the super capital stage. That was the opposite of the gameplay that they wanted to take part in.
Yeah, I think at this point it's worth noting that Skill Yourself as an alliance came into existence for the express purpose of participating in the alliance tournament initially. This was a bunch of guys who really enjoyed their small gang fights, the fights where every single ship kind of counts. And so they decided that they were going to form an alliance. They would enter the alliance tournament and see how they did. As it turned out, for the few years that they were around, Skill Yourself did very well in the alliance tournament, every alliance tournament that they entered. And so it's very understandable that when they grew a bit larger, when they had these revenants that they used relatively exclusively, like Skill Yourself were very good at the using revenants to kind of punch upwards tactics, that as they grew, revenants would become less of an answer to what they were trying to do, and they would have to transition into the more traditional super capital meta. But also, you have to remember that Skill Yourself took Sov against the Drone Region Federations, something that previously they hadn't really worried about overly much. And they also set up a rental group. Again, something that prior to their involvement in the Holy Rental Empire, they hadn't really thought about that much. So it seemed to me, from what I was seeing and hearing at the time of Skill Yourself collapsing, that they had kind of been mired in Sov concerns that the major blocks have been dealing with and have kind of grown bureaucratic organizations around to deal with and manage. And they just hadn't anticipated that, hadn't really expected ultimately how much work it turns out to be. It's a hell of a slog owning Sov. And they discovered that they didn't want to do it. It wasn't their playstyle, it wasn't what they enjoyed, and they found themselves just not caring for the game that they had ended up playing.
Exactly. It's something that happened to Rooks and Kings, many years earlier, is they found themselves, well, it was kind of different because Rooks and Kings had a very specific playstyle, and that was no longer viable in this kind of N+1. So Skill Yourself relied on pilots being absolutely perfect in everything they did. And they were very, very, very good. But unfortunately, yeah, like you said, having all this Sov meant they needed to manage it and take care of things. And now that they were up against Test Alliance coming back from the north and regrouping and having a chance to kind of rest a bit, they knew that things were going to be much more difficult from now on, and they just didn't want to play anymore.
Yeah, this is something I actually had a chance to speak with some other members of the CSM with when it actually Skill Yourself started up, because I was around for that as well. And one of the things that a lot of veteran metagame, I guess, participants told me is that they generally don't see these FC-headed, very campaign-focused coalitions, and especially alliances, to last for a long period of time, because their identity is so focused around military campaigns and military victory that the second you put them in a position where they're not experiencing that, their whole system of legitimacy falls apart. And because of that, they weren't particularly concerned about the long-term effects that it would have. And I thought that was very interesting that people actually told me that stuff like this was going to go down the way it did years in advance, because they've seen this cycle play out before. And I think we're seeing, to some degree, a Skill Yourself too. Obviously, it's not quite in the same fashion. It's different people, it's different objectives, it's different goals, and even a different style of organisation. But Trigger Happy is this same kind of FC-driven campaign and combat-orientated alliance. And I wonder if that's going to fall into exactly the same thing that Skill Yourself did long term. I think we'll have to see. But it's important to note those kind of similarities.
That's going to be interesting to watch. Trigger Happy is a little bit different, though, compared to Skill Yourself. There's a couple of key differences. For one, again, Skill Yourself kind of came into being because they wanted to participate in the Alliance tournament. That was their focus, small gang PvP and stuff. That wasn't the case for Trigger Happy. Trigger Happy are obviously headed up by Kendar, who is a fantastic FC. He's an ex-FC director in Goonswarm. He ran Space Violence for a number of years. He's a really great guy, and he was obviously, as an FC director in Goonswarm, part of Goonswarm's leadership structure. He knows how the Imperium works as a coalition. He knows what makes us work and how the nullsec block works. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not I think the more interesting thing, I should say, is to see whether or not he will be able to implement a nullsec organizational structure in order to maintain the alliance, while still making sure that he can access the fights that he enjoys and that he went out to tribute with Trigger Happy to find, rather than whether or not he knows what he's getting into. Because I think that's the key difference there. The leadership of Skill Yourself, when they went into the Holy Rental Empire and ended up taking Sov, they didn't know what they were getting into when they took that Sov. Kendar definitely does, and so I think that will be the key difference that may define Trigger Happy's success compared to Skill Yourself's eventual failure.
Yep, exactly. More money, more problems.
But again, looking to the past to try and predict the future, we will see if this is all borne out.
I just think it's good to kind of note those similarities and those historical trends so that people can call me out on it later. Who knows, someone might be listening to this in 2020. Anyway, we do have one final topic to cover in this first half of the year, and that is something that you are right on the front lines of, and I'm sure have many great memories of, and that is the Drifter invasion.
No. That was basically my entire response to the Drifter invasion from the moment it spawned, right through the first, I think the Drifter invasion ended up lasting a week at its peak. The Drifters were hitting structures in, multiple systems across nullsec. You'd be seeing Drifters in, well, and I know in the Imperium space there was a single 24-hour period where we saw attacks in somewhere in the region of 150 to 170 systems multiple times in that day. They would go into that system, they would hit structures, we would go to those systems, we would kill those Drifters, we would be pulled out to other systems, kill those Drifters, and then they'd be right back where we started. This was a hell of a grindy thing for not just the Imperium, but also for Legacy Alliance, for Dead Coalition, basically anyone holding Sov. And yeah, this was a major misstep for CCP, in my opinion. They really did kind of bring the fight to us with the use of these NPC mechanics, and it did not go in their favor.
Well, okay, so that very well might be true, but I would like to point out that this fact kind of highlights how easy alliances, or alliances that hold many regions of space, have with managing all of this. They have invasions. They're normally concentrated in a few spots. But when you have something that basically blankets your entire region, now you have to scramble to get people on access lists to gun things and stuff like that. And it kind of, I don't know, it's kind of like, I don't want to say hilarious, but watching these alliances having to make the decision, okay, who are we going to trust to get these roles, to man structures and gun structures and stuff like that, when they've had the ability to manage, 3, 5, 8 regions, just, but with a handful. Well, a handful is a bit disingenuous to say, but with a relatively small amount of management people, it just kind of like highlights the fact that it's too easy to own regions of space on the level of a super coalition. And so having these drifters roll through kind of highlights, hey, maybe we should be splitting up. It would be a lot easier if we split, the spaces up between alliances, because now it wouldn't hurt so much, because each individual alliance is only responsible for like a few constellations. But I thought that was really interesting, how the major groups suffered more, because not only were the drifters attacking them, more, but they suddenly had to mobilize people with responsibility and roles to do that.
I think something something we're going to get to, obviously, in the second half of this, is at least the second version part of this video, or conversation, or however we're going to do this, is going to be discussing the, the blackout, yeah. And I think it really neatly bisects the year in terms of there is very clearly a pre- and post-blackout method of operation for alliances. And the Drifter invasion is a part of that. Because what we saw as a result of this is suddenly everyone realised that this talk of chaos and this talk of we might just do something and you're going to have to deal with it became very, very real to a lot of alliance leadership. Because what you're talking about there, January, in terms of like, you've got to rejig your organisation, you've got to think about changing the way that your space is held to adjust to this new mechanic. That is, or at least adjust the way that you're operating right now on an organizational level to not lose stuff as a result of this mechanical change. That is an incredibly drastic thing to be doing, and because of that, what we see in the latter half of the year is a lot of alliances waiting, and a lot of alliances wanting to be the first people to be able to adapt to whatever new change there is, because that's how they're going to get their advantage, rather than being proactive and going out and making their own advantage. And I think that's one of the problems that we're going to start to see, especially going deeper into 2020 potentially. That definitely fed into this feeling of stagnation throughout the latter half of the year, because obviously the first half of the year had a lot of stuff get started up.
Oh, for sure. What I want to be mindful of always is how players manage space. Obviously, we all agree that you can have too much space, but no one actually knows what that is. Between Legacy, Coalition, and that's including Brave, they own upwards between 8 and 11 regions, and that's largely that does not need to be managed. They have, moon pulls that they have to do and things like that. But, the overall, it's defended collectively, but the overall actual, name that controls all of this is, directors in the executor corp. So the balance is finding out, you don't want to make it so give the top half so much power that they're easily able to influence everything around in 5, 8, 11 regions, giving some of the guys, smaller guys, room to do things with not having this giant ocean of a coalition next to them. But
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. This latter half of the year is just going from the PL model of within the first hours of this balance pass rolling out, let's figure out the new thing. Everyone's like, watching what their neighbors are going to do, that kind of thing. That's a very timid approach to how are we going to adapt to this newest thing, because it's something completely different and something that we've never really seen before.
Yeah, the final thing that I kind of want to talk about with the Drifter invasion that I don't think we've touched on yet is the way it impacted player activity, not just in terms of the way people reorganized their management structures and what have you, but the way it impacted what players were doing at the time. Because if you think about it, the Imperium were deployed to Tribute, and after this happened, there was a lot of speculation that, it was going to happen anyway. There was never going to be anywhere else. It was just going to happen. But in the immediate aftermath of the Drifters initially attacking, the Mittani announced that basically we would be turning around and going home effective immediately. There was no question of can we stay in Tribute in Pure Blind? Can we stay and burn some more? There was no question of that. It was just, we are being attacked by NPCs on a level that we've never seen before. We have no idea what the hell is happening. We have to go home and defend the home. That is our space. We must have that. And so we turned around and we went home. In a similar manner, if not quite as extreme, Test and Legacy Alliance were deployed in Tenerifis, Amencia, Detorid, kind of fighting that slowly, steadily ongoing fight. But every time the Drifters attack, it was very noticeable that without anybody saying anything, there was basically a ceasefire agreed between Winter Coalition and Legacy and Fire and, Army of Mango potentially as well. They would all go back home and they would defend their structures and the fighting would be left for another day. And so, as much as people thought that this was spin, and will probably still say it's spin as I'm going to utter the words, this was an example of CCP bringing something into the game, temporary or not, that had a very noticeable impact on the way players chose to play the game. And I kind of hope CCP learned a lot from it. But at the same time, I hope they learned that it probably isn't the best way to go about things. Because this was really where, January, you mentioned Null First earlier on.
Yeah.
With the start of the Tranquility trading. But the Drifters were really where the Null First Discord kind of came into its own. And I'm aware that there were a couple of points where the Mittani went, I'm in Discords talking to goblins regularly now. What is going on with the world? So,
right.
These were incredible shifts. And there was even a comment on one of our INN articles about it where Aerith said, when you force people to do these things, when you force people to get into the trenches together, you make an enemy of yourself. And that is never going to be a positive thing for the EVE Online universe. EVE Online basically needs the nullsec powers to be at each other's throats.
Only in EVE Online is the worst thing that could happen a sudden breakout of peace.
Yeah, peace is hell. Peace really is hell.
Alright, well, on that wonderful note, it's been a blast talking to you guys for the past 3 hours, but I think it's time to call this a wrap. I look forward to covering the next 6 months with you in a call in like a week or so's time. We'll organise it after the talk is over. Thank you to everyone who listened, and I hope you enjoyed it. But until next time, fly smart.